I thought turning 32 would bring a quiet celebration with the family who raised me. Instead, I walked into the grand foyer of our family estate to find 40 relatives staring at me in dead silence. No balloons, no cake, just my father holding a manila folder and a sneer. That is when he handed me a DNA test and demanded $300,000 in backpay for raising a stranger. He thought he was evicting a freeloader. He did not know he had just handed the keys to his entire kingdom back to its rightful owner. My name is Paige, 32 years old, and a senior Title and Escrow Auditor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to strip you of everything. The heavy oak front door of the $4 million Tudor estate shut behind me with a loud thud. I had just driven an hour from my downtown apartment after receiving an urgent text from my mother, Beverly, claiming they had a massive birthday surprise waiting for me. I stepped into the sprawling living room, wiping the rain from my coat. Surprise was an understatement. The room was packed. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends were standing shoulder to shoulder on the imported Persian rugs. But no one shouted surprise. No one smiled. The silence in the cavernous room was thick and suffocating. The massive crystal chandelier cast a harsh light on 40 faces that looked at me with a mixture of disgust and cold anticipation. Richard, the man I had called Dad for 32 years, stood in the center of the room. He wore his tailored Italian suit, looking more like he was about to address a boardroom than celebrate his daughter. He did not step forward to hug me. He did not even say hello. He simply raised his right hand and held out a thick brown envelope. "Take it, Paige," Richard said. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, sharp and commanding. I reached out and took the envelope. My fingers broke the seal and pulled out the crisp white laboratory documents inside. "Read the bold print at the bottom of the second page," Richard ordered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Read it out loud for everyone to hear. Let us get this over with." I scanned the medical jargon until my eyes hit the highlighted section. Probability of paternity 0%. Probability of maternity 0%. "You are not ours," Richard announced, his voice booming across the silent room. "You are not a part of this family. You do not share our blood. We did some digging into the adoption records from 32 years ago. You were dumped on us under false pretenses. For 3 decades we have clothed you, fed you, sent you to private schools, and paid for your useless college degree." I stood there holding the papers. The hostility in the room was palpable. My Aunt Brenda scoffed loudly from the back by the fireplace. "Such a waste of our family resources," Brenda muttered, taking a sip of her wine. "We always knew she did not fit in. Look at her." Beverly stepped out from the crowd. My mother. She was dressed in a silk emerald gown, her diamond necklace catching the light. She did not look at me with a shred of maternal warmth. She looked at me like I was a pest that had finally been trapped. "Hand over your keys," Beverly demanded. She snapped her fingers aggressively in my face. "The house keys, the spare gate clicker, and the keys to the vehicle we bought you for your graduation. You have no right to drive a vehicle paid for by a family you do not belong to." I held my ground, looking directly into Beverly's eyes. "You invited me here on my birthday just to humiliate me in front of the entire extended family over a DNA test. Humiliation is the least of what you deserve," Beverly spat back, taking a step closer until I could smell the strong scent of her expensive perfume. "You have been leeching off this estate your entire life, living in the guest house for years rent-free before you finally moved out, eating our food, wearing clothes bought with our money." Before I could respond, Beverly lunged forward and snatched my designer handbag right off my shoulder. She unzipped it roughly, dumping the contents onto the pristine glass coffee table. My wallet, makeup, and keys clattered loudly against the glass. Beverly grabbed the heavy ring of keys and shoved the empty leather bag back into my chest. "We are done subsidizing a genetic stranger," Richard added, taking a step to stand shoulder to shoulder with his wife. "We want our money back, Paige. Every single dime we spent raising you. We had our accountants run the numbers. It comes out to roughly $300,000. Consider it a debt you owe us for your survival. You will pay us back, or we will ruin you." Cousin Greg laughed from the corner. She probably does not even have $3,000 in her checking account, Uncle Richard. Just throw her out on the street where her real parents left her. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd of relatives. They were enjoying this. They were reveling in my sudden downfall, standing in their designer clothes inside a mansion they believed represented their superior bloodline. You think you can ambush me, strip me of my car, and hand me an arbitrary bill for $300,000? I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. You think a piece of paper from a lab suddenly legally dissolves 32 years of documented guardianship and financial support? That is not how the law works, Richard. You cannot retroactively charge a child for their own upbringing. You do not get to tell us how the law works in our own house, Beverly screamed, her face turning a blotchy red. You are a fraud, an imposter who stole resources from our real family. You took attention away from Sydney. You took money that should have gone into our retirement accounts. You are nothing but a parasite we finally managed to identify and extract. Uncle Gary stepped forward, shaking his head. We always told you, Richard. We said she lacked the family ambition. All she does is look at boring property deeds all day. A glorified clerk, not a true member of this family. I am a senior Title and Escrow Auditor, Gary. I replied sharply, locking eyes with him. I find hidden money and expose fraudulent property claims for a living. Maybe you should remember that before you start lecturing me about ambition. Richard slammed his fist down on the glass table, rattling my spilled belongings. Do not speak to my brother that way. You have no authority here. You have no standing. You will sign a legally binding acknowledgement of your debt to this family today, or you will walk out of those front doors with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. The sheer audacity of the ambush was staggering. 40 people standing in a $4 million house circling me like vultures ready to pick my bones clean, simply because a cheek swab came back negative. They wanted to break me. They wanted to see me drop to my knees, cry, and beg for their continued financial charity. They wanted me to feel utterly worthless and completely alone in the world. But I did not cry. I did not beg. I simply stared at the man who had pretended to be my father, registering the absolute lack of love in his cold blue eyes. Sydney, the golden child of the family, suddenly pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She was wearing a silk dress that cost more than my first car, clutching the arm of her husband, Desmond. Sydney looked at me with a sickening mixture of fake pity and undeniable triumph, fully ready to deliver the next devastating blow. Sydney patted her perfectly styled blonde hair and offered a pout that belonged in a cheap daytime soap opera. It is so tragic, Paige. Honestly, I always knew we were completely different. You never had the family drive, the elegance, the pedigree. It makes total sense now why you always felt like a stray dog we took in out of the cold. But do not worry, Desmond has graciously offered his top-tier legal expertise to help us sort out this unfortunate mess before things get ugly. Desmond adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. At 31, he was a junior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the city. As an African-American man who had climbed the elite corporate ladder with aggressive precision, he carried an air of absolute superiority. His cold brown eyes assessed me not as a sister-in-law, but as a hostile deposition waiting to be crushed. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers, slapping them onto the glass table right next to my spilled belongings. I suggest you read this carefully, Desmond said, his voice smooth, but heavily laced with venom. What you are looking at is a legally binding restitution agreement. Richard and Beverly were grossly defrauded. They invested capital time and emotional labor under the false presumption of biological relation. In the eyes of the law, your continued consumption of their financial resources constitutes a classic, undeniable case of unjust enrichment. I stared at him, almost wanting to laugh at the sheer absurdity of his statement. Unjust enrichment. I was an infant, Desmond. Are you seriously trying to apply corporate contract law to the childhood of a minor? Desmond tapped the heavy document with an engraved gold pen. I am applying the law of torts, Paige. Constructive fraud, misallocation of fiduciary funds. You receive the massive benefits of a luxury lifestyle private university tuition and a trust allowance that was intended solely for Richard and Beverly's biological offspring. Sydney is their only true heir. You have effectively siphoned $300,000 of her rightful inheritance. You stole from my wife. Sydney leaned her head against Desmond's shoulder, nodding eagerly like a victim finally getting her justice. It is my money, Paige. You stole my future inheritance to fund your mediocre life. The least you can do is sign the paper and walk away before we drag your professional name through the mud and ruin your career. Desmond uncapped the gold pen and held it out to me like a weapon. The terms are non-negotiable. By signing this document, you formally acknowledge the debt of $300,000. We will place a lien on your future earnings and require a monthly wage garnishment until the balance is paid in full. In exchange, the family will agree not to press criminal charges for fraud. You sign this hand over the keys to the guest house and walk out of that front door right now. If you refuse, I will file a civil lawsuit by Monday morning. I will freeze your bank accounts. I will subpoena your employer, and I will make sure the legal fees alone bankrupt you before we even reach a courtroom. The grand living room erupted into murmurs of vicious approval. Make her sign it! Desmond Uncle Gary shouted from the back of the room. Do not let her leave until she pays up. Aunt Brenda chimed in her wineglass, raised in a mocking toast. Get what is ours, Richard. The crowd of relatives closed in a few inches, creating a suffocating wall of tailored suits and expensive evening gowns. They were a pack of wolves smelling blood, thrilled by the prospect of my absolute ruin. Beverly crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, while Richard stood tall, looking down his nose at me, as if I were a speck of dirt on his expensive Persian rug. But as the initial shock and sting of betrayal wore off, the professional auditor inside my brain clicked into high gear. I looked at the meticulously drafted 40-page contract resting on the glass table. I looked at the pristine laboratory DNA results. I looked at the way my parents had conveniently gathered every single family member, forced me to hand over my keys instantly, and had a ruthless corporate lawyer standing by with a weaponized legal document ready to go. This was not a sudden emotional reaction to a shocking family secret. This was a highly coordinated financial ambush. They did not just find out about this DNA test today. You do not draft a 40-page restitution contract over a weekend. You do not calculate exact childhood expenses down to the dollar without weeks of forensic accounting. They had been planning to publicly execute my place in this family for a long time, and more importantly, they were desperate to get my signature on a binding contract before I had a chance to speak to my own legal counsel or look into the property records myself. I looked at Desmond, who was still holding out the gold pen with a smug expression. As a title and escrow auditor, I deal with aggressive lawyers trying to bully vulnerable people into signing fraudulent property deeds every single day. I know what a desperate legal bluff looks like. I dissect complex financial manipulation for a living. I reached out, but I did not take his gold pen. Instead, I picked up the heavy stack of contract papers. For a brief second, a wide grin spread across Sydney's face. She thought she had won. She thought the immense pressure of 40 glaring relatives and a threat of total bankruptcy had finally broken my spirit. I looked Desmond dead in the eye, gripped the thick stack of papers with both hands, and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the silent room. Sydney gasped, stepping back as if I had just physically slapped her across the face. I let the torn halves fall onto the floor at Desmond's expensive leather shoes. You are a corporate lawyer, Desmond, so you should know better than to draft absolute garbage. There is no court in the United States that will enforce a retroactive billing invoice for raising a child, biological or not. This contract is nothing but an unenforceable intimidation tactic, and your threat of a civil suit for unjust enrichment is a laughable abuse of the legal system. I am not signing anything. I am not giving you a single dime. And I am certainly not letting a fake golden child and her arrogant husband bully me out of the only home I have ever known without a fight. Desmond's jaw clenched, his professional composure completely shattering. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides, his eyes flashing with genuine rage. You are making a massive mistake, Paige. I will destroy your life. I will have security throw you out onto the street right now. Richard took a menacing step toward me, his face turning red with anger. You heard him. You made your choice. Get out of my house immediately before I have you arrested for trespassing. He raised his hand, signaling the two large private security guards who had been standing quietly near the dining room doors. They began marching toward me, their faces completely devoid of emotion, ready to physically drag me out into the cold rain. The heavy footsteps of the security guards thumped against the hardwood floor. I braced myself. But before their massive hands could grab my shoulders, a calm, deeply resonant voice cut through the tense silence of the room. I would strongly advise against touching her, the voice said. Everyone froze. The guards stopped in their tracks, looking confused. The crowd of relatives parted like the Red Sea, revealing a man who had been standing quietly in the back corner by the grand piano the entire time. He was in his early 60s, wearing a simple beige trench coat over a gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans. In a sea of designer ball gowns and bespoke Italian suits, he looked completely out of place. Yet he carried an undeniable aura of absolute authority. Richard sneered, his face contorting with arrogant indignation. Who the hell are you? How did you get in here? This is a private family event. Security throw this vagrant out along with the girl. The man did not flinch. He walked forward slowly, his hands casually tucked into his coat pockets. He stopped a few feet away from me, turning his piercing gaze toward Richard. I walked through the front door, Richard. Just like I used to 32 years ago. I see you have done some redecorating. The crystal chandelier is a bit gaudy for my taste, but then again, you always did like pretending to be royalty with other people's money. Richard's mouth dropped open. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took a stumbling step backward, his calves hitting the edge of the glass coffee table. Elias, Richard whispered, his voice trembling in a high-pitched frequency I had never heard before. No, that is impossible. You are supposed to be gone forever. Beverly let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were wide with sudden, unadulterated terror. The emerald silk gown she wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Elias, Uncle Gary echoed, looking back and forth between Richard and the stranger. Who on earth is Elias? The man finally turned to look at me. His eyes were a striking shade of green, the exact same shade of green as mine. He offered a small, warm smile that radiated genuine affection before turning his attention back to the hostile crowd of relatives. My name is Elias Thorne, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the grand living room. And I am the true owner of this land. But more importantly, I am Paige's biological father. A collective gasp ripped through the room. The aunts and uncles who had just been cheering for my downfall were suddenly paralyzed by confusion. Aunt Brenda lowered her wineglass, her jaw hanging open. Sydney looked like she had been physically struck, staring in horror at the casually dressed man claiming to be a billionaire property owner. Desmond was the first to recover from the shock. He stepped forward immediately, putting on his aggressive corporate lawyer persona, trying to regain control of the room. Listen here, old man. I do not know what kind of scam you are trying to pull, but you are trespassing on private property. My clients hold the deed to this estate. I will have you arrested for fraud, breaking and entering, and criminal harassment. Elias let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You must be the lawyer's son-in-law I have heard so much about. Desmond, was it? You might want to check the county property records again before you start throwing around legal threats that could get you disbarred. Your clients do not hold the deed. They never have. Elias reached into the inner pocket of his trench coat and pulled out a single neatly folded document printed on heavy legal paper. He held it up for the room to see. This estate, along with the 200 acres surrounding it, is entirely owned by the Thorne Family Trust. Richard and Beverly were never the property owners. They were simply the estate managers hired by my late father to maintain the grounds. They were caretakers, glorified housekeepers, nothing more. That is a lie! Beverly shrieked, her voice cracking as she desperately clung to Richard's arm. We own this house. We raised this family here. You have no right to come in here and spread these vicious lies to our guests. The only lie, Elias said, his tone turning icy and commanding, is the one you two have been living for the past 3 decades. You forged adoption papers. You framed me for embezzlement to force me out of my own family's home. And you kept my daughter here, feeding off the generous maintenance fund the trust provided for her upbringing while pretending you were self-made millionaires. My mind raced. As a title and escrow auditor, my professional instincts flared to life. I knew exactly what a family trust was, and I knew how ironclad they could be. But hearing that my entire life had been funded by a secret trust, and that the people I called my parents were nothing but frauds, made the room spin. The pieces were rapidly falling into place. The sudden DNA test today. The massive family ambush. The desperate 30-page contract Desmond had drafted so hastily. Why today, I asked aloud, my voice cutting clearly through the frantic murmurs of the crowd. I looked at Elias, then glared at Richard. If they have been living this lie for 32 years, why ambush me with a DNA test and try to kick me out right now? Elias turned to me, his green eyes softening with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Because of the specific stipulations in my father's trust page. The trust was designed to hold the estate and its financial assets in protective custody until you were old enough to protect yourself from vultures. The terms explicitly state that full unencumbered ownership of this property and the remaining millions in the maintenance fund automatically transfers to my biological daughter on her 32nd birthday. Elias slowly checked his silver wristwatch. Which means as of midnight last night, this entire estate legally transferred into your name. They knew the transfer was coming. They needed you to sign away your rights and acknowledge you were not family before the trust administrators contacted you on Monday morning. They were trying to steal your inheritance through a fabricated civil dispute. The silence in the room was completely deafening. The golden child Sydney looked at her parents in absolute horror, realizing her entire wealthy identity was built on a lie. "Mom." Dad, Sydney whimpered. "Is he telling the truth? Do we not own this house?" Richard was hyperventilating frantically, loosening his expensive silk tie. He could not form a single coherent word. The confident, wealthy patriarch who had just demanded $300,000 from me was now crumbling into a pathetic, terrified mess. Desmond snatched the document from Elias's hand, his eyes aggressively scanning the legal text. I watched Desmond's arrogant expression melt into pure, unadulterated panic. His hands actually started to shake. As a lawyer, he knew a legitimate, watertight legal document when he saw one. He slowly lowered the paper, refusing to look at his wife or his in-laws. "Well, Desmond," I asked, taking a confident step toward him. "Does it look like unjust enrichment to you now?" Desmond swallowed hard and took a step back, physically distancing himself from Richard and Beverly. Elias turned his attention back to the 2 large security guards who were still standing awkwardly in the center of the room. "Gentlemen, you were hired to remove trespassers from the premises. I suggest you do your job, because the only people standing in this room without legal permission are Richard Beverly and every single person they invited to my daughter's house." The 2 security guards exchanged nervous glances. They were paid hourly, and stepping into the middle of a multi-million-dollar property dispute involving a hostile corporate lawyer and a man claiming to be a billionaire trust fund heir was way above their pay grade. Slowly, the guards lowered their hands and backed away toward the foyer, silently refusing to touch anyone. "Are you completely useless?" Beverly shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. She dug frantically into her emerald silk gown, producing her diamond-encrusted smartphone. "I am calling the police. I am calling the sheriff right now. You are a lunatic, Elias. You think you can barge in here with fake documents and ruin my daughter's birthday? You are going to jail." She dialed 911 with shaking fingers, screaming into the receiver that a dangerous intruder was threatening her family and trying to steal her house. The wait for the police was excruciating. No one in the room dared to speak. The arrogant smirks that had plastered my relatives' faces just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. Aunt Brenda quietly set her wine glass down on a side table and slowly edged her way toward the coat closet. Several other cousins followed her lead, suddenly deciding that this family gathering was over. They did not want to be anywhere near a police investigation or a federal property dispute. Desmond paced back and forth across the Persian rug, aggressively tapping his phone screen. He was already texting his legal team, trying to figure out if Elias Thorne was a real threat. Sydney just stood there, biting her meticulously manicured nails, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of local law enforcement illuminated the massive bay windows of the living room. Heavy knocks pounded on the front door. Richard scrambled to open it, desperate to regain his position of power. Sheriff Miller stepped inside his heavy-duty boots, leaving wet tracks on the marble floor. He was accompanied by 2 deputies. Sheriff Miller had been the town's chief law enforcement officer for over 15 years. He knew Richard and Beverly from the local country club, which is exactly why Richard immediately tried to play the victim. "Sheriff, thank God you are here," Richard gasped, pointing a shaking finger directly at Elias. "This man broke into my home. He is waving around forged property documents and terrorizing my family. I want him arrested for criminal trespassing and fraud immediately. Throw him in cuffs." Sheriff Miller held up a calloused hand, signaling Richard to calm down. He looked around the room, noting the tense crowd and the 2 security guards standing awkwardly by the wall. "Let us take a breath, Richard. Who is the individual you are accusing?" Elias stepped forward, calmly retrieving the heavy legal document from his trench coat once again. "Good evening, Sheriff Miller. My name is Elias Thorne. I am the biological father of Paige and the legal owner of this estate. I am not trespassing. I am simply visiting my own property, which according to the Thorne Family Trust officially transferred to my daughter at midnight." Elias handed the document to the sheriff. "I strongly suggest you read the 3rd page, specifically the clauses regarding estate management and the transfer of deed." Sheriff Miller took the paper. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his uniform pocket and began to read. The room was dead silent. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Beverly was practically vibrating with rage, waiting for the sheriff to slap handcuffs on Elias. Instead, Sheriff Miller sighed heavily, folded the document, and handed it back to Elias. He took off his glasses and looked directly at Richard. "Richard, I cannot arrest this man," the sheriff said plainly. "What do you mean you cannot arrest him?" Beverly screamed, stepping forward. "He is an intruder. He is lying." "Ma'am, please keep your voice down," the sheriff warned sternly. "I am looking at a heavily notarized, federally recognized trust document. It lists Elias Thorne as the primary trustee and Paige as the sole beneficiary upon her 32nd birthday. Whether you dispute the validity of this document or not, this is a complex civil matter, not a criminal one. I do not have the jurisdiction to determine property ownership on the spot based on conflicting claims." Desmond stepped up, puffing out his chest. "Sheriff, I am a corporate attorney. My clients have established residency here for over 3 decades. You cannot just let a stranger walk in and claim ownership. By law, you have to remove him to preserve the peace." Sheriff Miller narrowed his eyes at Desmond. "And as an attorney, you should know that law enforcement does not handle evictions without a court order signed by a judge. Until a civil court reviews these trust documents and issues a formal ruling, Elias and Paige have just as much right to be on this property as you do. In fact, if this trust is valid, you are the ones who might be facing trespassing charges. But tonight nobody is getting arrested, and nobody is getting forcefully evicted." Richard looked like he was going to have a heart attack. "You expect me to sleep in my own house with this lunatic? I expect you to act like adults," the sheriff replied coldly. "Go to separate wings of the house. Call your lawyers in the morning. If there is any physical violence tonight, I will come back and arrest whoever throws the first punch. Have a good night." Sheriff Miller tipped his hat to Elias and walked out the front door, his deputies following closely behind. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the toxic family inside, with the very people they had just tried to destroy. The remaining relatives did not hesitate. Without saying a word, uncles, aunts, and cousins grabbed their coats and practically sprinted out the door, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a massive legal war. Within 3 minutes, the grand living room was entirely empty, save for Richard, Beverly, Sydney, Desmond, Elias, and me. We stood in a circle of pure hostility. The power dynamic had completely shifted. The ambush had failed spectacularly. "You think you have won," Desmond hissed, pointing his gold pen at me again. "You have just declared war on the wrong people. I am going to bury you both in injunctions. You will not see a dime of this estate." I smiled, feeling a surge of absolute confidence. "Save your breath, Desmond. You are going to need it for the judge." I turned to Elias. "Let us go to the guest house. The air in here is completely toxic." Elias nodded, offering me his arm. With perfect composure, we turned our backs on the four most hateful people in my life and walked out the side door, heading toward the stone pathway that led to the guest house. The cold rain had stopped, leaving the night air crisp and clear. We stepped into the quiet, familiar space of the guest cottage. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind us. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. Desmond would undoubtedly try to use every dirty legal trick in the book to freeze the assets and kick us out. But he did not know he was fighting a title and escrow auditor, who already knew where to look for the bodies buried in their financial records. They wanted to steal my home. Now I was going to tear down theirs. Inside the guest house, the silence was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos that had just unfolded in the main mansion. I walked over to the heavy curtains and pulled them shut, blocking out the view of the sprawling lawn and the rain-slicked driveway. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline dump that was currently coursing through my system. I turned around to face the man sitting on the edge of the small velvet sofa. Elias Thorne, my biological father. He looked exhausted, but his green eyes were sharp and entirely focused on me. I took a deep breath, walked over to the small kitchenette, and poured 2 glasses of water. I handed him one and sat in the armchair opposite him. "I need the truth," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my head. "All of it. I am an auditor, Elias. I deal with paper trails, forged deeds, and hidden assets every single day. Do not give me the sugar-coated version. Tell me exactly how 2 ordinary people managed to steal a billionaire's estate and keep his daughter hostage for 32 years. Elias took a sip of the water and leaned back, his expression darkening with decades of unresolved anger. "It started with my father, Jonathan Thorne," Elias began. "He was a brilliant real estate developer, but as he grew older, his health rapidly declined. He became reclusive. He needed constant care and someone to manage the day-to-day operations of the estate." Enter Richard and Beverly. I furrowed my brow. Wait, they were not wealthy investors. They always told me Richard made his fortune in early tech stocks, and Beverly came from old money. Elias let out a bitter laugh. Old money Beverly was a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm, and Richard was a glorified property manager. My father hired them as live and estate caretakers. They were given a modest salary, free room and board in the very guest house we are sitting in right now, and strict instructions to maintain the grounds. That was it. But Richard and Beverly were dangerously ambitious. They saw a sick, isolated old man sitting on a mountain of wealth, and they decided they wanted it for themselves. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "Go on." 32 years ago, my wife died giving birth to you, Paige," Elias said, his voice softening with a sudden wave of grief. I was completely devastated. I fell apart. I started drinking heavily, neglecting my responsibilities to the family business. Richard and Beverly used my grief as their perfect opportunity. As my father's health deteriorated, they slowly took control of the estate's finances. Beverly used her accounting background to manipulate the ledgers. They started funneling millions of dollars into offshore accounts and doctored the paperwork to make it look like I was the one embezzling the family funds. My jaw tightened. "They framed you." "Perfectly," Elias confirmed. "By the time my father found out about the missing money, he was too weak to investigate properly. Richard presented him with a mountain of fabricated evidence pointing directly at me. My father was furious. He threatened to hand the evidence over to the federal authorities and send me to prison for decades. He gave me an ultimatum: leave the state immediately, cut all ties with the family, or spend the rest of my life behind bars. I was a grieving, broken man, facing a massive legal conspiracy I could not disprove. So I ran. I left you in the care of my father, thinking you would be safe. But my father died 6 months later." Elias continued, his hands gripping the glass tightly. "And that is when Richard and Beverly enacted the final phase of their plan. My father had set up an ironclad trust. The estate and its massive financial assets were placed into a protective fund. The stipulations were very clear. The property could not be sold or liquidated. A generous monthly maintenance fund would be dispersed to whoever was raising the sole Thorn heir, and upon her 32nd birthday, full unencumbered ownership of the entire trust would automatically transfer to her. The realization hit me like a freight train. My breath caught in my throat. I was the golden ticket. Exactly, Elias said, leaning forward. They needed you. Without you, the trust would have dissolved. The assets would have been seized by the state, and they would have been out on the street. So they forged adoption papers. They bribed a corrupt family court judge who has long since passed away legally, declaring themselves your adoptive parents. They moved out of the guest house and into the main mansion. For 32 years, they have been living a life of extreme luxury funding, their expensive cars, their country club memberships, and Sydney's massive credit card bills using the trust's monthly maintenance allowance meant for your upbringing. I stood up, pacing the small room as the pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Sydney. They always treated her like royalty while making me feel like an unwanted burden. They hated me because I was a living reminder that the money was not truly theirs. They despised you, Paige, but they were entirely dependent on you. Elias agreed. You were a financial hostage, but they knew this gravy train had an expiration date. Your 32nd birthday, midnight last night. I stopped pacing and looked at him, the ambush, the DNA test. Yes, Elias said. The trust administrators are legally obligated to formally contact you on the first business day following your 32nd birthday to execute the deed transfer. That is this coming Monday. Richard and Beverly panicked. They needed you to sign a legally binding document renouncing your ties to the family and acknowledging a massive debt. If you had signed that contract Desmond drafted, they would have used it to file an emergency injunction in civil court on Monday morning, claiming you committed fraud and forfeited your rights to the trust. It would have tied the estate up in litigation for years, allowing them to drain whatever was left. The sheer level of manipulation was staggering. My entire life, every cruel comment, every time they told me I owed them for my private school tuition, every time they called me an outsider, it was all a calculated psychological operation. They wanted to break my self-esteem so thoroughly that I would not fight back when they finally moved to steal my inheritance. They thought I was weak, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. They thought they could bully me out of a $4 million estate with a cheap parlor trick and a fake bill. They vastly underestimated you, Elias said, a proud smile forming on his lips. When you tore that contract in half, you destroyed their only leverage. I walked over to the small wooden desk in the corner of the room and unzipped my laptop bag. I pulled out my computer and flipped it open. The screen glowed, reflecting in my eyes. I am a Title and Escrow Auditor, Elias. I spend my life tracking down fraudulent real estate transactions. Richard and Beverly are amateurs playing a game they do not understand, and Desmond is an arrogant corporate lawyer who just tied himself to a sinking ship. What are you going to do? Elias asked, watching me as my fingers flew across the keyboard. I am going to do my job, I replied coldly, pulling up the county's secure real estate database. I am going to find the paper trail. Because people like Richard and Beverly cannot help themselves. If they have been living a lie this big for 32 years, they have absolutely made a fatal financial mistake somewhere. And when I find it, I am going to use it to destroy them. I did not sleep a single wink that night. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the estate, I was already 4 cups of coffee deep. My laptop screen was a maze of county property records, tax assessments, and historical deed transfers. I was just beginning to peel back the layers of Richard and Beverly's financial history when the sharp crunch of gravel outside broke my concentration. I walked to the guest house window and pulled back the heavy curtain. 3 police cruisers were parked at steep angles across the driveway, their light bars flashing bright blue and red in the early fog. 2 armed officers were already stepping out, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. and walking right behind them, holding a thick manila folder and wearing a triumphant smirk, was Desmond. He had traded his tailored evening suit for a sharp navy blazer looking every bit the ruthless corporate lawyer, ready to execute a kill shot. I slammed my laptop shut, shoved it into my leather bag, and hurried toward the front room where Elias was already putting on his trench coat. "They are back," I said, my voice tight with warning. Elias nodded calmly. "Desmond does not waste time. Let us see what kind of legal fiction he has managed to concoct before breakfast." We opened the guest house door and stepped out onto the porch just as the officers approached the bottom step. Desmond flanked them, standing tall with a look of absolute arrogance. "Good morning, Paige," Desmond said, his tone dripping with fake courtesy. "I told you I would bury you in injunctions. I just did not want to wait until Monday." One of the police officers stepped forward, holding out a folded piece of paper. "Elias Thorne?" the officer asked. "I am Elias," he replied steadily. The officer handed him the document. "You are being served with a temporary ex parte restraining order issued by Judge Thompson of the County Civil Court. You are required to vacate these premises immediately and maintain a distance of no less than 500 feet from Richard Beverly and Sydney. You are also barred from initiating any contact with them, direct or indirect." I stared at the officer in absolute disbelief. "An ex parte order?" I asked loudly, stepping down the porch stairs. "A judge signed that without even holding a formal hearing." "That is correct," Desmond interjected smoothly. "An ex parte order is granted in emergency situations when there is an immediate threat of physical harm or severe emotional distress. My clients filed a sworn affidavit at 6 o'clock this morning, stating that this man is a dangerous con artist who forcefully entered their home last night, threatened them with physical violence, and is currently using extreme psychological manipulation to isolate their daughter." "You lied to a judge," I spat, glaring at Desmond. "You fabricated a threat of violence to weaponize the police." Desmond adjusted his crisp lapels. "I presented compelling evidence of a hostile home invasion by an estranged individual with a history of disappearing. The judge agreed that for the safety of the family, Elias needs to be removed until a formal hearing can be scheduled in 3 weeks. By then, the trust administrators will have already been notified of your refusal to sign the documents, and we will have the estate perfectly secured. You have exactly 10 minutes to collect your personal belongings and vacate the property," Mr. Thorne, the second officer, instructed, resting his hand on his radio. "If you refuse to comply, you will be arrested for violating a court order." Elias did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply folded the restraining order and placed it safely inside his coat pocket. He turned to me, his green eyes completely calm and full of unwavering trust. "Do not let this rattle you, Paige. This is exactly what desperate people do when they are backed into a corner. They use the legal system as a blunt instrument. Desmond thinks he has won the game because he cleared the board, but he forgot who he is playing against." I nodded, gripping the heavy leather strap of my laptop bag tightly. "I will find the paper trail, Elias. Go to the local diner in town. I will call you as soon as I have what I need." Elias walked back into the guest house and emerged 2 minutes later with his small overnight bag. He walked past Desmond without giving him a single glance, got into his rental car, and drove down the long, winding driveway, followed closely by 2 of the police cruisers. Desmond watched the red taillights disappear with a deeply satisfied grin. The remaining police officer walked over to the main house to file his report, leaving Desmond and me entirely alone in the driveway. Just then, a white commercial van pulled through the heavy iron front gates. The side panel read, "Advanced Security Locksmiths." Desmond waved the locksmiths over, pointing toward the mansion. Richard and Beverly stood proudly on the porch, watching the workers approach with smug smiles. "You see, Paige," Desmond said, stepping closer to me. "You might be smart reading deeds, but you are completely out of your depth here. I play in the big leagues. I file emergency motions before the county court even opens. I banished your savior, and now we are changing every single lock. You are completely locked out." I looked at Beverly, who gave me a very sickening wave. "You think physical locks matter?" I asked. Desmond chuckled, crossing his arms. I think you are standing in a driveway with nothing. Your car keys are locked inside. All you have is that bag. He turned his back and walked away. I stood alone on the cold asphalt. Inside my bag was my laptop, the only tool I needed to burn their fraudulent empire to the ground. The real war had finally begun. I turned my back on the massive iron gates of the estate and started walking down the winding suburban road. I did not have my car. I did not have a spare change of clothes. But I had my laptop bag, and right now, that was the most dangerous weapon in the county. It was a crisp morning, and the 2-mile walk to the center of town gave me the perfect opportunity to clear my head. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for people who did not know how to read a financial ledger. I pushed open the glass door of a quiet independent coffee shop on Main Street. The bell chimed, signaling my arrival. I ordered a large black coffee with the cash I had in my pocket, walked straight to a corner booth facing the door, and slid into the leather seat. I pulled my laptop from its protective sleeve, flipped it open, and connected to the private encrypted hotspot on my phone. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before flying across the keys. I bypassed the public property search portals that regular citizens use. Those sites only show you the polished surface-level history of a home. As a senior title and escrow auditor, I had high-level security clearance to the back end of the county registry of deeds. I logged into my professional portal, entering my credentials and dual authentication codes. The screen loaded into a stark, no-nonsense interface filled with numerical search fields. I typed in the parcel identification number for the Thorne family estate. The screen populated with 32 years of property tax records, municipal assessments, and utility liens. On the surface, Richard and Beverly had been meticulously careful. The property taxes were paid on time every quarter. The water and electricity bills were spotless. To an amateur, it looked like the clean financial profile of a responsible, wealthy family. But I am not an amateur. I do not look at what is paid. I look at where the money comes from, and more importantly, who legally authorized the transactions. I pulled up the master deed history. Elias was telling the exact truth. The estate was firmly held in the Jonathan Thorne Living Trust. Richard and Beverly were never listed as grantors, grantees, or trustees. Their names were entirely absent from the chain of title. They were legally invisible. So how does a legally invisible couple fund a country club membership, multiple luxury vehicles, a daughter's lavish wedding, and a corporate lawyer son-in-law? You cannot do that on the monthly maintenance stipend Elias mentioned. That stipend was generous, but it was designed for groceries, property upkeep, and private school tuition for one child. It was not designed to support 30 years of extreme, unchecked arrogance. I opened a new tab and accessed the secondary lien registry. This is where banks record mortgages, equity lines of credit, and collateral holds. If you want to find a rat, you look in the debt records. I filtered the search by the estate's parcel number and hit enter. A massive red flag instantly popped up on my screen. My breath hitched in my throat. There it was. A commercial mortgage lien filed exactly 4 years ago. The principal amount was staggering. $2.5 million. It was a cash-out refinance loan secured directly against the equity of the $4 million Thorne estate. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the digitized loan documents. This was impossible. A bank does not hand over $2.5 million in cash to someone who does not own the property. To execute a loan of that magnitude, the bank requires absolute proof of ownership, title insurance, and a notarized signature from the primary trustee. The primary trustee was Elias, and he had been missing for decades. I clicked on the attached PDF containing the original loan application and the promissory note. I scrolled down to the signature page. There, sitting plainly in blue ink, was a signature that made my blood boil. It read, Elias Thorne. But it was completely wrong. I had seen Elias's handwriting just hours ago when he showed us the trust document. His signature was sharp, slanted, and distinct. This signature was loopy, forced, and clearly traced. But a traced signature is not enough to fool a commercial bank underwriter. They need legal authorization. I kept digging through the digitized file until I found the golden ticket. It was a special power of attorney document, supposedly drafted and notarized in a different state, granting Richard full legal authority to act as the financial proxy for Elias Thorne. The notary stamp on the document belonged to a man whose license had conveniently expired 3 years ago. I sat back in the leather booth, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Richard and Beverly had not just stolen my childhood. They had committed massive, federally punishable mortgage fraud. They had hired a dirty notary, forged Elias's signature, and successfully tricked a regional bank into granting them a $2.5 million lump sum. They took out a massive loan against a house they did not own using the name of a man they framed, and they were using the stolen cash to play pretend rich people. I opened my auditing software and ran a trace on the loan disbursement. The money had been wired into a Shell LLC registered under Beverly's maiden name. From there, it had been aggressively funneled into various personal accounts over the last 4 years. I saw wire transfers to luxury car dealerships. I saw massive payments to high-end interior decorators. But the most interesting wire transfer caught my eye immediately. It was a massive lump sum payment of $400,000 sent exactly 2 years ago. I traced the routing number. The money was sent to an escrow account for a luxury real estate brokerage in Manhattan. The memo line on the wire transfer read simply, Sydney and Desmond Penthouse down payment. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. Desmond, the hotshot corporate lawyer who had just threatened to ruin my life and banish me to the streets, was living in a multi-million-dollar penthouse funded entirely by stolen money. He had built his entire arrogant persona on the proceeds of federal wire fraud. I highlighted the transactions, downloaded the forged power of attorney document, and saved everything to an encrypted folder on my hard drive. Desmond thought he had outsmarted me by locking me out of the house. He had no idea he had just given me the uninterrupted time I needed to find the exact weapon that would destroy his career, his marriage, and his freedom. I pulled out my phone and found Sydney's contact. It was time to start breaking their family apart from the inside out. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the wire transfer record, ensuring the bank routing numbers, the authorization date, and the $400,000 amount were perfectly legible. I attached the image to a text message, selected Sydney's contact, and typed a single calculated sentence. I think we need to have a little chat about your Manhattan penthouse. I hit send. Then I packed my laptop securely into my leather bag and walked out of the coffee shop. I knew exactly where Sydney would be. It was Saturday morning, and Sydney's weekend routine was as predictable as her massive credit card debt. She always spent her Saturdays at the high-end boutiques on Oak Street, blowing through whatever allowance Richard and Beverly had deposited into her checking account that week to maintain her illusion of wealth. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address. 20 minutes later, I was standing on the pristine sunlit sidewalk of the upscale shopping district. I spotted her almost immediately. Sydney was walking out of a highly exclusive designer boutique, a massive branded shopping bag hooked over her forearm. Her oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled blonde hair. She was holding her phone, staring at the screen with an expression of sheer confusion. She had just seen my text. "Sydney," I called out, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. She snapped her head up, her eyes widening as she saw me approaching. Her initial shock quickly morphed into her usual arrogant disdain. She looked around nervously, probably terrified that someone in her elite social circle would see her talking to the sister who had just been violently ousted from the family. "What are you doing here?" Sydney hissed, taking a step back, as if my presence might physically contaminate her expensive silk outfit. "Desmond told you to stay away from us. We have a restraining order against your fake father, and if you do not leave me alone, I will call the police right now and have them draft one for you, too." "Go ahead and call them," I replied, stopping just 2 feet in front of her. "In fact, why do you not call the FBI while you are at it? They handle federal wire fraud, and I am sure they would love to hear about how you funded your real estate purchases." Sydney scoffed, rolling her eyes in dramatic fashion. "What are you talking about, Paige? You are losing your mind. I am not playing these desperate games with you. You got kicked out. Deal with it and move on with your mediocre life. I did not flinch. I simply pointed at the phone clutched tightly in her hand. Look at the screenshot I just sent you, Sydney. Look closely at the LLC that transferred the funds and then look at the receiving account. That is the escrow account for the luxury real estate brokerage that sold you and Desmond your multi-million-dollar Manhattan penthouse 2 years ago. $400,000, paid in full entirely in cash. Sydney glanced down at her phone screen again, her perfectly manicured thumb hovering over the image. So what Mom and Dad gave us that money as a wedding gift. They are wealthy. They wanted us to have a nice place in the city. You are just jealous because they never gave you a single dime. They did not give you a dime either, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register. Because that money was not theirs to give. Your parents are broke, Sydney. They have always been broke. That $400,000 came from a $2.5 million commercial mortgage loan they secretly took out against the estate. They used forged power of attorney documents and traced signatures to steal equity from a property they do not even own. Your parents committed massive mortgage fraud to fund your fake lifestyle. The color began to drain from Sydney's face, but she shook her head, trying desperately to maintain her reality. You are lying. You are just trying to scare me because you are homeless and jealous. Dad is a successful investor. He always has been. I stepped closer, invading her personal space. Richard was a glorified property manager who stole from his employer. I corrected her, watching her eyes widen. He and Beverly have been siphoning money from a maintenance fund meant for my upbringing. And when that was not enough to cover your massive spending habits, they forged federal bank documents to take out a fraudulent loan. And the best part? They wired a huge chunk of that stolen cash directly into the escrow account for your penthouse. Sydney's breathing hitched. The designer shopping bag slipped slightly down her arm. No, she whispered, her eyes darting back to the phone screen as if the numbers would magically change. Yes, I continued relentlessly. I am a Title and Escrow Auditor, Sydney. I investigate this exact type of fraud for a living. Do you know what happens when a commercial bank discovers that a massive mortgage was secured using forged documents? They call in the loan immediately. And when they realize the money was already spent, they follow the paper trail to recover the stolen funds. That paper trail leads straight to your front door in Manhattan. The bank will seize your penthouse. They will repossess your home. She stared at me, her arrogant facade completely crumbling into raw, unfiltered panic. Desmond is a lawyer, she stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. He is brilliant. He will fix it. He will protect us from this. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. Desmond is a junior partner at a corporate law firm who just built his life on stolen money. He signed the purchasing documents for that penthouse. He is legally tied to an asset purchased with the proceeds of federal bank fraud. If the State Bar Association finds out he is involved in a chain of wire fraud, he will not just be disbarred. He will lose his entire career, his reputation, and he will go to federal prison right alongside your parents. Sydney looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped her phone. She let go of her designer shopping bag, allowing it to drop onto the pavement. The crisp, branded paper crinkled loudly, but she did not even notice the expensive items spilling out. You cannot do this, she breathed, looking at me with pure terror. You cannot show this to the bank. You will ruin my life. You will ruin Desmond. We will have absolutely nothing. I am not ruining anything, Sydney. Your parents did that when they decided to steal a house and frame an innocent man. Desmond did that when he marched onto my driveway this morning with a fake restraining order and changed the locks on my home. You all thought you could just discard me like trash and keep living your fraudulent little lives without any consequences. Please, Paige. Sydney begged, her voice cracking as tears welled up in her eyes. Do not send this to anyone. We can figure something out. I will talk to Mom and Dad. I will make them give you whatever you want. I promise. I do not want anything from them, I said, my tone absolute ice. I am just giving you a heads up, sister to sister. The bank is going to repossess your penthouse, and your husband is going to lose his license. You might want to return whatever is in that bag and get your cash back. You are going to need every single penny for a federal defense attorney. I turned around and walked away, leaving Sydney standing completely paralyzed on the pristine sidewalk. Her mouth was open, her eyes wide with shock, staring at the phone in her hand like it was a ticking time bomb. The first domino had just been violently pushed over. By the time Sydney got home to Desmond, the panic would spread like wildfire, and the perfect unified front they had shown me last night would tear itself apart. I pulled my phone back out, ready to initiate the next phase of the collapse. It did not even take 2 hours. My phone vibrated in my hand as I sat on a park bench overlooking the city skyline. The caller ID flashed Desmond's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my thumb across the screen to answer. "You have completely lost your mind," Desmond barked through the speaker. His voice was tight, lacking the smooth, arrogant cadence he had projected in my driveway that morning. "Sydney is having a hysterical breakdown in our living room because of whatever psychotic lies you just fed her on Oak Street." "I am sure she is," I replied calmly. "The truth has a funny way of ruining a Saturday shopping trip." "Listen to me very carefully, Paige," Desmond growled. "I do not know what kind of forged documents you think you have, but you are treading into criminal defamation territory. I want to meet, tonight, face to face. You are going to show me exactly what you have, and then you are going to drop this entire pathetic charade." I smiled, listening to the underlying panic in his voice. I chose an upscale, highly visible steakhouse downtown called the Capitol Grill. 8 o'clock, Desmond. Do not be late, and bring your wife. She is going to want to hear this. I ended the call. The second phase was officially in motion. At exactly 8 o'clock, I walked into the dimly lit mahogany-paneled dining room of the Capitol Grill. The air smelled of expensive red wine and charred prime rib. The hostess led me to a private corner booth where Desmond and Sydney were already seated. Sydney looked like a complete wreck. Her makeup was slightly smudged, and she was gripping a crystal water glass so tightly her knuckles were white. Desmond, however, was attempting to maintain his alpha male facade. He wore a sharp black turtleneck and a tailored blazer, his jaw clenched, as I slid into the leather booth across from them. "Let us get one thing straight," Desmond said before I even had a chance to look at the menu. "You are not going to extort us. I am a corporate attorney. I deal with nuisance lawsuits and corporate blackmail for a living. You show me whatever fake paper trail you fabricated, I dismantle it, and then you sign the trust over to Richard and Beverly just like we demanded last night." I did not say a word. I simply unzipped my leather bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I opened the flap and slid a neat stack of high-resolution color printouts directly onto the center of the white tablecloth. "I am not here to extort you, Desmond," I said, keeping my voice low and completely level. "I am here to give you a professional courtesy review before I submit my findings to the federal authorities." Desmond scoffed, but his eyes immediately darted down to the papers. Sydney leaned in, her breathing shallow and erratic. I tapped the first document with my index finger. "That is the commercial mortgage lien your in-laws took out 4 years ago. $2.5 million secured against an estate they do not legally own." I tapped the second page. "That is the special power of attorney document granting Richard financial authority over Elias Thorne. Notice the notary stamp. The license expired 3 years prior to the date of execution. It is a blatantly forged document." Desmond's eyes scanned the text rapidly. His legal brain was processing the information at lightning speed, and I could physically see the blood draining from his face. But he tried to hold his ground. So what? Desmond countered, his voice losing a fraction of its confidence. "Richard and Beverly committed mortgage fraud. That is their problem. Sydney and I had nothing to do with their loan application. You cannot touch us." I smiled, a cold, predatory smile that made Sydney physically flinch. I moved the first 2 documents aside and tapped the third piece of paper. "That is where you are completely wrong, Desmond. You see, a commercial bank does not just hand over $2.5 million based on a single forged power of attorney. They require a secondary legal review. A letter of opinion from an independent attorney verifying that the trust allows for the property to be leveraged. And guess whose law firm provided that letter of opinion? I slid the final document across the table. It was the legal sign-off from the bank's closing packet. Right there on the bottom right corner was the official stamp of Desmond's corporate law firm, accompanied by his unmistakable looping signature. You acted as the reviewing counsel for the fraudulent loan, Desmond were stated, watching his eyes widen in sheer horror. You knowingly signed off on forged documents to push the mortgage through. You facilitated a massive federal crime, and exactly 1 week after this loan was funded, an untraceable LLC wired $400,000 directly into your escrow account to pay for your luxury penthouse. Desmond stared at his own signature. He stopped breathing. The confident, ruthless lawyer who had threatened to throw me out on the street had completely vanished. He was looking at his own legal execution. You knew, I continued relentlessly. You knew the house belonged to a trust. You knew Richard and Beverly were stealing the equity. You helped them do it because you wanted that massive down payment for your penthouse. You traded your legal ethics and your entire career for a piece of stolen real estate. That is a lie, Desmond choked out, but his voice was barely a whisper. I did not know the power of attorney was forged. They told me Elias authorized it. Save it for the judge, I replied coldly. As a title and escrow auditor, my report goes directly to the State Bar Association and the Mortgage Fraud Division of the FBI. Do you know what the State Bar does when they see a lawyer facilitating $2.5 million in bank fraud to enrich himself? They do not just disbar you, Desmond. They make an example out of you. You will lose your license. Your firm will fire you immediately to save their own reputation, and you will face up to 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy. Sydney let out a muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. Desmond sat perfectly still, his eyes glued to the documents on the table. He was a cornered animal, realizing for the first time that every single exit was completely blocked. I sat back in the leather booth and picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip, letting the absolute weight of their destruction settle over the table. The hostile dinner had quickly turned into a funeral, and I was the one delivering the eulogy. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The soft jazz music playing through the restaurant speakers seemed entirely disconnected from the sheer panic radiating from the two people sitting across from me. Then the dam finally broke. "How could you be so incredibly stupid?" Desmond Sydney shrieked. Her voice shattered the quiet ambiance of the dining room. Several heads from adjacent tables immediately snapped in our direction. Desmond flinched, holding his hands up to quiet her, but Sydney was completely unhinged. She slammed her palms down on the white tablecloth, rattling the heavy silverware and knocking over a crystal salt shaker. "You told me my parents gave us that money. You told me it was a clean gift. You are a corporate lawyer. You went to a top-tier law school. You are supposed to protect us from things like this, not sign your name on a forged document and drag me into a federal wire fraud investigation. You risked our entire life, our penthouse, my reputation, everything we have built." "Keep your voice down, Sydney," Desmond hissed through gritted teeth, his eyes darting nervously around the room to see who was watching. People were beginning to whisper and point. "I will not keep my voice down," she yelled, tears of absolute rage streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "You lied to me. You married me promising a life of absolute luxury, and now you are telling me you built our entire marriage on stolen money. If the bank takes my home, my friends will find out. The entire country club will know we are frauds. You are going to ruin me." That was the breaking point for Desmond. The polished, controlled corporate attorney completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate man pushed to his absolute limit. He slammed his fist onto the table so hard, his water glass tipped over, soaking the linen cloth and sending a wave of ice water cascading onto Sydney's lap. "Your reputation," Desmond roared, leaning so far forward he was almost entirely out of the booth. "Do not you dare sit there and play the innocent victim, Sydney. You are the sole reason we are in this mess." Sydney gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "Excuse me, you heard me?" Desmond fired back, his voice vicious and loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. You and your parents are a complete fraud. When I met you, I thought you came from actual wealth. I thought you had a trust fund. But within 6 months of our marriage, I was drowning in your insane credit card debt. $50,000 on designer bags, $80,000 on luxury vacations you demanded we take, just so you could post photos online to impress people who do not even care about you. You were bleeding my bank accounts completely dry. I was working 80-hour weeks at the firm just to keep the lights on while you paraded around town pretending to be an heiress. Sydney looked around utterly humiliated as people at the surrounding tables openly stared at the spectacle. "Stop it, Desmond," she whispered frantically, trying to shrink down into the leather seating. "I will not stop," Desmond snapped. His face was twisted with pure contempt. "Your father came to me with that forged power of attorney because he knew I was desperate. Richard knew I needed a massive cash injection to keep my firm from noticing I was missing billable hours because I was constantly managing your financial disasters. He offered me a way out. $400,000 to look the other way and sign one piece of paper. I did it for you. I risked my law license, my entire career, and my freedom to fund the pathetic fake reality you absolutely refuse to wake up from, so do not you dare act like I ruined your life. You ruined mine." The sheer brutality of his words left Sydney completely paralyzed. She slumped back into the booth, her mouth opening and closing silently. The illusion she had maintained for her entire life was completely shattered, not just by me, but by the husband who had actively enabled it. They had turned on each other the exact second the money was threatened, exposing the absolute toxic core of their relationship. There was no love there, only a mutual transaction of greed that had just gone bankrupt. Desmond turned his furious, bloodshot eyes back to me. His chest was heaving under his tailored blazer. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. He realized that screaming at Sydney did not solve his primary problem. I was still sitting there completely unfazed, holding the evidence that would send him to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. "You are going to hand over those files right now," Desmond demanded. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "You are going to hand over the printouts, you are going to delete the digital copies, and you are going to sign the trust over to Richard by Monday morning." I looked at him with complete indifference. "I already told you, Desmond. My report is going to the State Bar and the FBI. There is no negotiation. You made your bed with fraudsters, and now you are going to sleep in it." Desmond lost the last shred of his sanity. He lunged across the wide table, completely disregarding the plates and silverware crashing to the hardwood floor. His large hand shot out and clamped down on my right wrist with a bone-crushing grip. I winced, but I absolutely refused to pull away or show fear. I locked eyes with him. "Listen to me, you pathetic little auditor." Desmond hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. "You think you can destroy my life and walk away. I know people. I know how to make people disappear without a trace. If you send that file to the authorities, you will not live long enough to see me disbarred. I will end you. Do you understand me? I will physically end you before you can hit send." The threat was absolute and genuine. He was gripping my wrist so tightly my fingers were starting to tingle, but I remained perfectly calm. I did not scream. I did not try to hit him. I simply shifted my gaze past his shoulder. A young waiter wearing a crisp white shirt and a black apron had rushed over to our table after the glasses shattered, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw Desmond physically attacking me. The waiter stood there, eyes wide with alarm, holding a silver serving tray awkwardly against his chest. "Excuse me," I said, my voice clear, steady, and projecting perfectly into the quiet dining room. "This man just violently grabbed my wrist and threatened to murder me. Please call the police immediately. Tell them there is an active assault occurring at table 12. Desmond's eyes widened in sudden horror. He let go of my wrist as if I had suddenly caught fire. He dropped back into his seat, realizing exactly what he had just done in a room full of wealthy patrons. "I will do that right now, ma'am," the waiter said, his voice shaking slightly. He immediately turned and sprinted toward the host stand at the front of the restaurant, pulling a phone from his pocket. "You did not just commit mortgage fraud, Desmond?" I said, gently rubbing my bruised wrist while maintaining unbroken eye contact. You just committed felony assault and communicated a death threat in front of 30 witnesses in a five-star restaurant. I do not even have to wait for the FBI to arrest you. The local police are going to do it tonight." Desmond stared at me, the reality of his situation finally crashing through his thick skull. Sirens began to wail in the distance, the high-pitched sound cutting through the ambient noise of the upscale restaurant and growing louder by the second. He looked down at the shattered glass on the floor, then at Sydney, who was still sobbing hysterically into her hands, and finally back at me. Without saying another word, he grabbed his wife by the arm, hauled her out of the leather booth, and practically dragged her toward the rear emergency exit. They fled the restaurant like absolute cowards, abandoning their half-eaten dinner and their completely shattered reality just moments before two uniformed police officers pushed through the front doors. I did not chase them. I sat calmly in the booth and waited for the officers to approach. I gave a detailed statement ensuring the waiter corroborated every single word regarding Desmond's physical aggression and verbal death threat. I provided the officers with Desmond's full name, his home address in Manhattan, and the name of his corporate law firm. However, when the lead officer asked if I wanted to press formal felony assault charges right then and there, I shook my head. I told them I was terrified of his connections and needed to consult my attorney before moving forward. It was a calculated delay. Filing an official police report created a documented time-stamped paper trail of his violent instability, which would be incredibly useful for the federal authorities later. But having him arrested locally tonight would tip off Richard and Beverly too early. I needed the entire family to remain completely comfortable in their arrogance for just 24 more hours. I thanked the officers, paid for my untouched glass of water, and walked out into the cool night air. I rubbed my wrist, which was already beginning to form a dark purple bruise, but a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. Desmond's loss of control was the greatest gift he could have possibly given me. The physical threat did not scare me in the slightest. It gave me the perfect, undeniable leverage I needed to spring my ultimate trap. I hailed a taxi and directed the driver to a modest motel on the outskirts of town where Elias had rented a room after being unlawfully evicted from his own estate. When I knocked on the door, Elias answered immediately. His expression hardened the second he saw the bruising on my wrist. He ushered me inside, his jaw clenched with quiet fury. "He put his hands on you, Elias," stated, his green eyes flashing with a dangerous protective instinct. "I will tear that arrogant lawyer apart." I held up my hand to stop him. "No, Elias, this is exactly what we needed. Up until an hour ago, I was just a nuisance with a laptop. Now I have a verifiable reason to act like a terrified, broken victim. Desmond thinks he scared me into submission. We are going to let the rest of the family think the exact same thing." I sat down on the edge of the motel bed and pulled my phone from my pocket. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and mentally prepared myself for the greatest acting performance of my life. I needed to sound completely defeated. I dialed Richard's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. They were probably ignoring my calls, assuming I was calling to argue about the restraining order. I immediately called back. On the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. "What do you want?" "Paige," Richard answered, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you are calling to beg for a place to sleep, you can forget it." I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I let my voice tremble, injecting it with exactly the right amount of desperate panic. "Richard, please!" I choked out, manufacturing a small sob. "Please tell Desmond to leave me alone. He attacked me at the restaurant. He grabbed me and told me he was going to kill me." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of ice clinking in a glass. Richard was likely pouring himself a drink, completely unbothered by the fact that his son-in-law had just assaulted me. "Desmond is a passionate man protecting his family," Richard replied smoothly. "You pushed him into a corner with your ridiculous accusations and your fake trust documents. What did you expect to happen when you started threatening people who are far more powerful than you? You brought this on yourself, Paige." "I am done," I whispered, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. "I cannot fight you anymore. You win. I just want out." I want to leave the state and never see any of you again." The line went completely silent. I knew I had his full attention. "I will sign the relinquishment papers." I continued, my voice sounding weak and thoroughly broken. "I will sign away my rights to the Thorn Trust. I will sign whatever Desmond drafted. I do not care anymore. I just cannot walk away with absolutely nothing. I need a fresh start. If you give me $50,000 in cash, I will sign the deed over to you and I will disappear from your lives forever." I heard the muffled sound of Richard putting the phone on speaker. Beverly's shrill voice immediately echoed through the receiver. $50,000. Beverly laughed cruelly. "You want us to pay you $50,000 for something that already belongs to us? You really are pathetic, Paige. You finally realized you are nothing without our charity and now you are begging for scraps." "It is cheaper than fighting a prolonged legal battle in probate court," I countered, keeping my voice shaky. $50,000 is nothing to you. You can have the entire estate, the maintenance fund, everything. Just give me enough to move across the country and start a new life. Please, Beverly, just let me go." I could practically hear the greedy gears turning in Richard's head. He knew the trust officially recognized me as the sole owner on Monday morning. If he could secure my signature on a notarized relinquishment document for a mere $50,000, he would secure a $4 million estate and permanently eliminate the only threat to his massive mortgage fraud scheme. To a desperate, arrogant criminal, it was the deal of a lifetime. "Fine," Richard said, his tone thick with triumphant superiority. "You will get your $50,000, but we do things on my terms. We are hosting a private gathering at the estate tomorrow evening with some very important international real estate investors. You will arrive at exactly 8 o'clock. You will enter through the back door. My personal notary will be waiting in the study. You will sign the paperwork, take your cashier's check, and you will leave my property immediately. If you try to pull any stunts, I will have security throw you to the curb without a single dime. Do we have an understanding?" "In hell, yes," I whispered softly. "Thank you, Richard. I will be there." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. The fake tears instantly vanished from my face. I looked up at Elias, who was standing by the window, with a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. "They took the bait," I said, tossing my phone onto the bed. "They are so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they actually believe $50,000 is enough to buy my silence." "They think they broke your spirit," Elias noted, crossing his arms. "They think you are coming to surrender." I reached into my leather laptop bag and pulled out a small black USB drive, rolling it thoughtfully between my fingers. "I am going to walk into their house, look them dead in the eye, and sign their worthless piece of paper. But while they are busy celebrating their victory, I am going to plug this network tap into Richard's home office router. They wanted a war over real estate. Tomorrow night, I'm going to give them a federal indictment." The next evening at exactly 8 o'clock, I pulled my rental car up to the grand iron gates of the Thorn estate. The driveway was already packed with luxury black town cars and sleek sedans. Valets in crisp white shirts were rushing back and forth, opening doors for men in expensive suits and women draped in designer jewelry. Through the massive bay windows, I could see the glow of the crystal chandelier and the silhouettes of people mingling with champagne flutes. Richard and Beverly were going all out. They were hosting a lavish dinner party to court the foreign real estate investors they desperately needed. They wanted a quick $4 million cash sale so they could liquidate the stolen asset and flee the country before anyone asked too many questions. I bypassed the grand front entrance and walked around the side of the mansion, heading for the kitchen door, just as Richard had demanded. The gravel crunched under my boots. I was dressed simply in a black turtleneck and dark jeans, completely contrasting the extravagant ball gowns and tailored suits inside. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. Private caterers rushed past me, carrying silver trays of caviar and seared scallops. No one paid any attention to me. I was just another ghost in the house I used to call home. I slipped through the swinging doors into the main hallway. The sound of a string quartet drifted from the living room. Peeking around the corner, I saw Beverly holding court. She was wearing a nude diamond necklace, laughing loudly at a joke made by a wealthy-looking man with a thick European accent. She was playing the role of the aristocratic matriarch perfectly. Then her eyes darted toward the hallway and locked onto me. Her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she excused herself from the investors. She marched over to me, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. "Look at you," Beverly sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Sneaking in through the back, like the hired help. It suits you perfectly. Richard is waiting in his office. Do not touch anything on your way there, and do not speak to our guests. We are finalizing the sale of this property tonight, and I will not have you ruining our negotiations with your pathetic presence." I did not say a word to her. I simply nodded and walked past her, heading straight for the heavy mahogany doors of Richard's home office. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The office smelled of expensive cigars and aged scotch. Richard was sitting behind his massive oak desk, shuffling through a stack of thick legal documents. Standing next to him was a short, balding man carrying a leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately as the same corrupt notary whose expired stamp was on the forged power of attorney. Richard looked up, a triumphant, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Right on time, Paige," Richard said, leaning back in his leather executive chair. "I was starting to think you might actually be stupid enough to put up a fight. Have a seat. Let us get this over with." I walked over and sat in the rigid guest chair opposite his desk. Richard slid a piece of paper toward me, followed by a cashier's check. $50,000 exactly as requested, Richard gloated, tapping the crisp check with his index finger. "And right here is the formal declaration of relinquishment. By signing this, you legally disavow any claim to the Thorne family trust, this estate, and any future financial support. You admit that you are not biologically related to us and have no legal standing to contest our ownership." I picked up the document and pretended to read it carefully. My heart was pounding, but my hands were perfectly steady. I needed to keep him talking. I needed a brief distraction. "You really think this makes you a winner, Richard?" I asked, my voice deliberately soft, playing the role of the defeated victim. Richard laughed, a harsh, arrogant sound that filled the room. "I do not think I am a winner, Paige. I know I am. I took a sick old man's fortune. I lived like a king for 32 years. And now I am cashing out for $4 million. Tomorrow morning, Beverly and I are boarding a first-class flight to a country that does not ask questions about where your money comes from. And you get to take your little check and disappear into absolute mediocrity. You were nothing but a pawn in my game, and now the game is officially over." He was so caught up in his own twisted victory speech that he did not even realize he was confessing his entire plan. I looked down at the floor. Right beneath his massive oak desk, tucked against the baseboard, was the main router for the estate's internet network. The green indicator lights blinked steadily in the dim room. "I just need a glass of water," I said, letting my voice crack perfectly. "My mouth is dry. I cannot sign this until I have a sip of water." Richard rolled his eyes, utterly annoyed by my apparent weakness. He gestured to the balding notary. "Go to the wet bar in the corner and pour her a glass of water so we can get her out of here." The notary turned his back and walked toward the small bar on the other side of the room. Richard leaned forward, opening his top drawer to grab a pen. That was my window. I had exactly 3 seconds. I dropped my pen onto the floor. "Oh, sorry," I mumbled, bending down out of Richard's line of sight. My hand shot into my pocket, retrieving the tiny black USB network tap. I reached under the desk, my fingers blindly finding the open port on the back of the router. I shoved the drive in until it clicked securely into place. I scooped up my pen and sat back up in my chair just as the notary turned around with a glass of water. I took the glass with a trembling hand, took a slow sip, and set it down on the coaster. Richard handed me his expensive fountain pen. "Sign it," he demanded. I uncapped the pen and signed my name on the bottom line of his worthless document. It did not matter that I signed it. A contract signed under the pretense of hidden massive federal fraud is entirely unenforceable. I pushed the paper back across the desk and picked up the cashier's check, sliding it into my pocket. Good girl, Richard mocked, inspecting the signature. Now get out of my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. As I reached the brass handle, I paused and looked back at him one last time. He was already pouring himself a celebratory glass of scotch, completely unaware that the tiny device I just plugged into his network was currently bypassing his firewalls. "Enjoy your party, Richard," I said quietly. I walked out of the office, slipped past the bustling caterers in the kitchen, and exited into the cool night air. I walked down the long driveway, leaving the glowing mansion behind me. As soon as I reached the main road, I pulled out my phone. A green notification popped up on my screen. The network tap was live. I had full access to every email, every offshore bank account login, and every encrypted message Richard sent or received. The trap was set, and the timer had just started ticking. 2 blocks away from the glowing estate, an unmarked black utility van sat quietly under the cover of a massive oak tree. I walked briskly through the cold night air, the gravel crunching softly beneath my boots, until I reached the back doors. I knocked twice, paused, and knocked once more. The heavy metal door swung open from the inside. Elias reached out a hand and helped me pull myself up into the dimly lit interior. The back of the van looked like a mobile command center. Screens lined the walls, casting a pale blue glow over the faces of the occupants. Sitting at the main console was Special Agent Reynolds, a hardened veteran of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I had contacted his office yesterday afternoon, presenting the initial evidence of commercial mortgage fraud. When he saw the forged power of attorney and the direct link to a prominent corporate law firm, he bypassed standard bureaucratic channels and brought a mobile tactical unit straight to our town. "Did it work?" Reynolds asked. His eyes locked on a black progress bar hovering on his primary monitor. "It is plugged directly into his main router," I confirmed, taking a seat on a metal stool next to Elias. "Richard thinks I just signed away my entire inheritance for $50,000. He is currently pouring scotch for his foreign buyers, completely oblivious to what is happening right outside his window." Suddenly, the black progress bar on Reynolds' screen flashed bright green. A massive stream of compressed files began pouring into the secure federal server. The network tap I installed was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It bypassed Richard's rudimentary commercial firewalls and mirrored every single byte of data stored on his local network and cloud backups. "Let us see what kind of secrets a fake millionaire keeps," Reynolds murmured, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. He ran an instant decryption protocol on the incoming folders. The screen split into multiple windows, rapidly populating with spreadsheets, scanned PDFs, and years of archived emails. As a title and escrow auditor, I look at complex financial documents all day long, but the sheer volume of organized criminal activity flashing across those screens was absolutely staggering. Richard and Beverly had not just committed a single act of mortgage fraud. They had constructed a massive, highly sophisticated labyrinth of tax evasion and embezzlement spanning over 3 decades. "Look at this," Reynolds said, bringing a complex spreadsheet to the center screen. "These are the ledgers for the Thorne Family Trust Maintenance Fund. For 32 years, Richard has been reporting a fraction of the actual stipend to the IRS. He funneled the rest through a series of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Belize. He completely washed the stolen money before bringing it back into the country as untaxed corporate dividends." Elias leaned closer to the monitor, his jaw tight. "They used my father's money to build an empire of absolute lies. How much did they hide?" Reynolds ran a quick aggregate calculation. "Based on these preliminary ledgers alone, we are looking at roughly $8 million in unreported income. And that does not even include the $2.5 million fraudulent mortgage they took out 4 years ago. This is not just a civil property dispute anymore, Elias. This is a massive federal crime syndicate operating out of a suburban mansion." But the most damning evidence was not just the bank statements, it was the communication logs. Reynolds opened an archived email folder labeled Legal Counsel. It contained hundreds of encrypted messages between Richard and Desmond. My arrogant brother-in-law had not just blindly signed off on the mortgage documents. He was the architect of the entire scheme. I pointed at a specific email chain dated 4 years ago. Open that one, Reynolds. The subject line read Asset Liquidation Strategy. Reynolds clicked the file. The email was written directly by Desmond. It clearly outlined the exact steps Richard needed to take to successfully forge the special power of attorney. Desmond provided the name of the corrupt notary, gave instructions on how to bypass the bank's internal underwriting flags, and explicitly negotiated his $400,000 cut to purchase the Manhattan penthouse. I got you, I whispered to myself, a cold wave of profound satisfaction washing over me. The corporate lawyer who had violently grabbed my wrist and threatened my life in a five-star restaurant was now officially on record conspiring to commit federal bank fraud. He had left a digital paper trail a mile long, arrogantly thinking his encrypted servers would protect him from a simple router tap. Reynolds leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. Well, Paige, you delivered exactly what you promised. We have them dead to rights. Wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. The list of felony charges is going to be longer than a grocery receipt. What happens now? Elias asked, looking at the IRS agent. Now we shut them down, Reynolds replied, pulling a secure satellite phone from his tactical vest. He dialed a direct line to the federal magistrate judge on call for the district. While the phone rang, he looked over at me. They are planning to sell the house tomorrow morning and flee the country, right? Yes, I answered. Richard told me the foreign investors are ready to sign a $4 million cash transfer tomorrow. They are having a celebratory dinner party to finalize the details as we speak. Reynolds nodded just as the phone connected. Judge, this is Special Agent Reynolds with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I am requesting emergency electronic arrest warrants for 4 individuals, Richard, Beverly, Sidney, and Desmond. Yes, sir. We just secured undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar tax evasion and wire fraud conspiracy. Flight risk is extremely high. They are actively attempting to liquidate a stolen $4 million asset to flee international borders. I sat in the dim light of the van listening as Reynolds methodically read off the statutes they had violated. Elias placed a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. We had done it. 32 years of psychological abuse, manipulation, and theft had just been completely dismantled in less than 20 minutes. The relinquishment paperwork Richard made me sign was utterly meaningless. The federal government was about to seize every single asset they possessed. Reynolds hung up the phone and turned back to his console, typing rapidly to process the incoming electronic signatures from the judge. The warrants are approved and active. The bank accounts belonging to Desmond and the LLCs are being frozen by the Federal Reserve as we speak. Tomorrow morning, we move in and make the arrests. I looked at the glowing monitors, watching the undeniable proof of their guilt continue to download. They had thrown me out into the rain with nothing but the clothes on my back. Now the full weight of the United States federal government was coming to crush their entire fake reality. The morning sun rose over the Manhattan skyline, casting a harsh light through the windows of the luxury penthouse. Desmond was already awake. In fact, he had not slept a single minute since fleeing the restaurant. He sat alone in his home office, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling slightly as he stared at his dual monitor setup. The panic from dinner had crystallized into pure survival instinct. He knew Paige was not bluffing. She had the documents. It was only a matter of time before the authorities asked questions, and Desmond had no intention of sticking around. He was not going to let them put him in a federal penitentiary. He needed to move his money. Over the past 4 years, he had quietly skimmed portions of his firm bonuses into a private banking account. It was his emergency parachute. Desmond opened a secure browser window and navigated to the login page of his offshore financial institution. He typed his password, fully expecting to see his balance. He planned to wire the entire amount to the Cayman Islands, buy a ticket to a non-extradition country, and completely disappear. The screen loaded. Then a stark red banner slashed across the web page. Error code 404. Account access suspended. Please contact your financial institution immediately. Desmond frowned, his heart skipping a beat. He aggressively mashed the refresh button. The same red banner appeared. He opened a new tab, logging into his domestic checking account. Access denied. Account frozen under administrative hold. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He grabbed his phone and dialed the Platinum Client Service line for his bank. He typed his account number rapidly, waiting for the system to route him to his wealth manager. Instead, the line clicked, and a stern voice answered. Corporate Security and Compliance. This is Agent Davis. How can I help you? Desmond swallowed hard. This is Desmond. I am a Platinum Tier client. I am trying to access my accounts this morning to initiate a routine wire transfer, but your system is giving me an error code. There must be some kind of technical glitch. There is no technical glitch, sir, the agent replied flatly. Your accounts have been locked. Locked, Desmond repeated. What do you mean locked? I am a partner at a major law firm. You cannot just lock my accounts without prior notification. Unfreeze them immediately, or I will have my firm file a massive lawsuit against your bank by noon. I am afraid your law firm cannot help you with this, the agent stated. Your accounts were frozen at exactly 3 in the morning, pursuant to a direct order from the Federal Reserve and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We are legally prohibited from releasing any funds. If you have questions, contact the federal authorities. Good day. The line went dead. Desmond slowly lowered the phone. The silence in the home office was absolutely deafening. The federal authorities. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together. Paige had not just reported him to the local police. She had orchestrated a massive coordinated federal strike. That was why she was so calm. She wanted him to feel powerful while she actively dropped a federal net right over his head. She set us up, Desmond whispered. Pure terror washed over him. If the IRS had frozen his bank accounts, it meant they already had the warrants. It meant they had seen the forged power of attorney and the encrypted emails. The federal government was mobilizing, and they were coming for him. He looked toward the bedroom door. Sydney was still asleep, exhausted from her hysterical breakdown. She was utterly useless to him now. If he woke her up, she would scream and slow him down. And Richard and Beverly. They were probably waking up right now, getting ready to host their arrogant dinner party, completely oblivious to the fact that their fake empire was collapsing. Desmond felt a surge of absolute hatred for his in-laws. They had dragged him into this mess with their greed. He was not going to sink with them. Self-preservation was the only thing that mattered. Desmond stood up his chair, scraping loudly. He walked over to the large oil painting behind his desk, pulled it aside, and quickly spun the dial on his hidden wall safe. The heavy metal door popped open. Inside were the physical emergency reserves. He pulled out a sleek black duffel bag and began stuffing it frantically. He grabbed thick stacks of $100 bills, totaling roughly $40,000 in untraceable cash. He threw in 3 expensive Rolex watches, a velvet pouch containing solid gold Krugerrands, and most importantly, his valid United States passport. He zipped the duffel bag shut, slung it over his shoulder, and walked quietly out of the home office. He did not leave a note. He did not go into the bedroom to say goodbye to the woman he had sworn to love. He simply walked to the front door of the penthouse, pulled it open, and stepped out. As he rode the private elevator down to the garage, his mind raced. His bank accounts were frozen, which meant his credit cards would be flagged the second he tried to use them. He could not buy a plane ticket online without triggering an alert. He needed to get to the international airport immediately, buy a ticket in cash at the counter, and get on the very next flight leaving the country. He stepped out of the elevator and power-walked toward his sports car, tossing the duffel bag into the passenger seat. He slid behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life. He slammed the car into gear and sped out of the garage, merging recklessly into the early morning Manhattan traffic. He was a corporate lawyer. He knew the FBI agents were probably already putting on their tactical vests to kick down his front door. But he had a head start. He had cash, he had a passport, and he was not going to let a title and escrow auditor take away his freedom. Desmond gripped the leather steering wheel, weaving through the morning commuters as he accelerated toward the highway. He was running for his life, completely unaware that his desperate escape plan was exactly what Paige had anticipated he would do. Desmond slammed his sports car into a tight space in the short-term parking garage of John F. Kennedy International Airport. He did not bother locking the doors, leaving the keys sitting right in the ignition. He threw the heavy black duffel bag over his shoulder and broke into a frantic sprint toward Terminal 4. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The tailored navy blazer that usually made him look like a master of the corporate universe was now drenched in nervous sweat. He kept his head down, pushing past bewildered tourists and slow-moving families pulling oversized luggage. He needed to find a ticketing counter that accepted cash and offered direct flights to a jurisdiction with zero extradition treaties to the United States. He scanned the massive glowing departure boards towering over the ticketing concourse. An airline flying direct to the Middle East had a flight boarding in 45 minutes. Perfect. He practically sprinted to the first-class ticketing line, cutting in front of a businessman and throwing his heavy blue passport alongside a thick stack of $100 bills onto the counter. The ticketing agent looked at the cash with mild surprise, her eyebrows raising, but she processed the transaction without asking any questions. Desmond snatched his printed boarding pass and headed straight for the security checkpoint. Every single second he stood in the security line felt like an absolute eternity. He constantly checked his phone, terrified that Richard or Sydney would call and tell him the FBI was already kicking down their front doors. But his screen remained completely blank. The silence was almost worse than knowing. When he finally reached the front of the line, he practically threw his shoes and his duffel bag into the gray plastic bins. He walked through the metal detector, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. The TSA agent lazily waved him through. Desmond grabbed his belongings, not even bothering to tie his shoelaces properly, before making a mad dash for the gate. The international terminal was massive, a sprawling corridor of high-end duty-free shops, crowded coffee stands, and flashing advertisements. Desmond ignored all of it. He kept his eyes locked on the overhead signs counting down the gate numbers until he finally reached his destination. He arrived just as the gate agent picked up the microphone and announced the final boarding call for first-class passengers. Desmond let out a ragged, shaking breath of relief. He had actually done it. He had beaten the system. He adjusted his blazer, wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead, and confidently joined the priority boarding lane. He was just steps away from the jet bridge, steps away from total freedom and a brand new life built on stolen money. He handed his passport and boarding pass to the smiling gate agent. She scanned the barcode. The machine beeped a pleasant green. "Thank you, Mr. Desmond," she said politely, handing his documents back. "Have a safe flight." Desmond reached out to take his passport. But before his fingers could even touch the paper, a cold, familiar voice echoed clearly through the busy boarding area. "I do not think he will be making that flight." Desmond froze. The blood turned to absolute ice in his veins. He slowly turned his head toward the sound. Stepping out from behind a massive concrete structural pillar near the boarding desk was me. I was wearing a sharp trench coat, my arms casually crossed over my chest, looking completely relaxed. Flanking me on either side were two men wearing heavy tactical vests with the letters FBI emblazoned across their chests in bright yellow. Special Agent Reynolds stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his holstered weapon. Desmond Reynolds announced, his voice carrying an unmistakable booming authority that caused the surrounding passengers to instantly step back in fear. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud and money laundering. Put your hands on top of your head and interlock your fingers immediately." For a split second, Desmond just stared at us. His elite legal brain, the one that had navigated complex corporate mergers and high-stakes litigation, completely short-circuited. He looked at the heavily armed FBI agents. Then he looked at the open jet bridge right behind the gate agent, calculating his impossible odds. Pure primal panic took over. Desmond dropped his boarding pass, hurled his heavy duffel bag directly at Special Agent Reynolds, and bolted. He shoved past a terrified elderly couple, knocking them aside as he sprinted back toward the main terminal concourse. He did not make it 20 feet. Two uniformed airport police officers who had been quietly positioning themselves near the adjacent seating area lunged forward. One officer tackled Desmond squarely around the waist, taking him entirely off his feet in a brutal flying tackle. Desmond hit the polished terrazzo floor with a sickening thud, the wind completely knocked out of his lungs. The second officer instantly dropped his heavy knee directly into the center of Desmond's back, pinning him forcefully to the ground. "Stop resisting," the officer barked violently, pulling Desmond's arms behind his back. The sharp click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed loudly, securing his wrists tightly together. The duffel bag he had thrown earlier hit the floor and unzipped on impact, spilling thick stacks of $100 bills and heavy solid gold Krugerrands across the carpet for the entire shocked terminal to see. I walked slowly toward the scene, my boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. I stepped right over the scattered piles of stolen cash and stopped next to where Desmond was lying face down, gasping desperately for air. His tailored blazer was torn at the shoulder, his expensive tie ruined, his face pressed humiliatingly against the cold, dirty ground. He tilted his head up slightly, his eyes wide with absolute terror and complete defeat as he looked at me. "You cannot do this," he wheezed, spit flying from his lips as he struggled against the cuffs. "I am a lawyer. I know my rights. I know the law." I crouched down so I was exactly at his eye level. I looked deeply at the man who had physically assaulted me, who had threatened my life, and who had built his entire arrogant existence on the money my fake parents stole from my real father. "I am sure you do know the law," Desmond, I replied, my voice dripping with absolute icy satisfaction. "But the thing about federal prison is they really do not let disbarred attorneys practice law from inside a concrete cell. Have a nice trip." I stood up, smoothed my coat, and turned my back on him. The FBI agents hoisted Desmond roughly to his feet and began loudly reading him his Miranda rights, dragging the once proud corporate lawyer through the crowded airport terminal in absolute disgrace. While Desmond was being thrown into the back of a heavily armored federal transport vehicle in complete disgrace. The atmosphere 30 miles away at the Thorne estate was a picture of absolute serene perfection. Sunlight streamed through the massive bay windows of the grand living room, catching the brilliant facets of the crystal chandelier and casting warm golden prisms across the imported Persian rugs. It was 10 o'clock on a beautiful Saturday morning, the perfect day to finalize a $4 million cash transaction. Richard stood at the head of the glass coffee table wearing a light gray tailored suit that screamed effortless wealth. He held a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon, his thumb pressing expertly against the cork. With a soft, satisfying pop, a wisp of white smoke curled into the air. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into 5 crystal flutes, passing them out with a wide, triumphant smile. "To new beginnings," Richard announced, raising his glass high, "and to a highly profitable partnership." Seated on the plush leather sofa across from him were the 2 foreign real estate investors, Mr. Henrik and his silent financial associate. Henrik was a wealthy European developer who specialized in purchasing luxury American estates for foreign portfolios. He took the champagne glass, nodding appreciatively at the opulent surroundings. "It truly is a magnificent property," Richard Henrik said, his thick accent echoing slightly in the vast room. "You have maintained the grounds beautifully. It is rare to find an estate of this size with such a remarkably clean title and no existing familial disputes. Usually, these generational properties are bogged down in probate courts or contested wills." Beverly let out a sharp, aristocratic laugh, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and a string of genuine pearls, playing the role of the refined matriarch flawlessly. "Oh, we do not tolerate drama in this family, Mr. Henrik. We believe in keeping things perfectly streamlined. In fact, we just recently finished cleaning house, so to speak." Henrik raised an eyebrow politely. "Cleaning house?" Beverly waved her manicured hand dismissively. "Just an unfortunate family matter. We had a troubled young woman living with us for years. An adopted child we took in out of the sheer goodness of our hearts. We gave her absolutely everything. Private schools, luxury vehicles, a roof over her head. But some people are just born with a rotten disposition. She turned out to be nothing but a financial leech. Constantly demanding more money, completely ungrateful for the sacrifices we made." Richard chuckled, shaking his head as if recalling a minor annoyance. "She actually tried to claim a stake in this very estate yesterday. Can you believe the sheer audacity? But we handled it swiftly. I had my attorneys draft a formal relinquishment contract, handed her a small severance check of $50,000, and sent her packing. She signed it without putting up a real fight. Bullies are always cowards when you finally stand up to them. Now she is entirely out of our lives, and the property is completely unencumbered. Sydney was sitting in the corner armchair wearing a designer silk blouse, but she did not look nearly as relaxed as her parents. She kept glancing down at her phone, her thumb aggressively swiping across the blank screen. She had been trying to call Desmond all morning, but every single call went straight to voicemail. A cold knot of anxiety was slowly tightening in her stomach. She remembered the high-resolution screenshots I had shown her on Oak Street. She remembered the sheer terror in Desmond's eyes at the restaurant before they fled. Sydney looked at her parents happily sipping champagne, completely unaware that the federal government might already know about their fraudulent commercial mortgage. For a brief second, Sydney considered speaking up. She considered warning them to stop the sale. But her own suffocating greed silenced her. She needed this sale to go through. If Richard secured the $4 million in untraceable offshore cash today, he could give her enough money to pay off the bank and save her luxury Manhattan penthouse. She chose to stay quiet, desperately hoping Desmond was simply at the law firm handling the situation quietly. "Sydney." "Darling," Beverly chirped, noticing her daughter's pale face and constant fidgeting. "Put the phone away. We are celebrating." "Where is Desmond anyway? I thought he wanted to be here for the final signing." Sydney forced a tight, brittle smile, quickly shoving the phone into her designer handbag. "He had an emergency meeting at the firm, Mom. A massive corporate merger. You know how demanding the senior partners are. He sends his apologies and his congratulations." Richard beamed with absolute pride. "That is my son-in-law. Always working, always closing the deal. He is a brilliant attorney, Henrik. Top of his class. He actually handled the preliminary legal review for this entire sale." "That is excellent to hear," Henrik replied, setting his empty champagne flute on a silver coaster. "Well, I believe we have celebrated enough for the morning. My associate has reviewed the final purchase agreement, and my bank in Geneva is standing by to initiate the wire transfer. $4 million cash deposited directly into the offshore routing number you provided." Richard's eyes practically gleamed with unrestrained greed. He picked up a thick leather folio from the table and opened it, revealing the final deed transfer documents. He smoothed the heavy paper with his hands, savoring the absolute power of the moment. The plan was working perfectly. He had outsmarted a billionaire's trust, he had crushed his ungrateful fake daughter, and Elias was currently rotting in a cheap motel. Richard was seconds away from securing enough stolen cash to live like a king for the rest of his life on a private beach. "Right here on the dotted line," Henrik Richard instructed, pointing to the bottom right corner of the page with a gold fountain pen. "Your signature legally binds the purchase, and the second the funds clear my account, I will hand you the master keys to the estate." Henrik reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his own silver pen. He clicked it open, leaning forward over the glass table. Beverly placed a hand over her heart, a look of pure manufactured nostalgia washing over her face. "It is a little bittersweet leaving this beautiful home behind, but knowing it is going to a buyer who truly appreciates its value makes all the difference. We are ready for our next grand adventure." Richard nodded solemnly, watching like a hawk as Henrik brought the tip of his pen down toward the crisp white paper. The entire room fell into a breathless, anticipatory silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the final seconds of their fraudulent empire. They were so blinded by the sparkling champagne and the promise of a massive payday that they did not notice the heavy, ominous rumble of multiple large vehicles pulling into the long driveway. They did not notice the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the living room windows. And they certainly did not hear the heavy, tactical boots marching in perfect unison up their pristine front steps. Henrik's pen touched the paper. Ink began to flow. And then the massive oak front doors of the estate were hit with such explosive force that the entire house seemed to shake. Section 17. The Smart Home Revolt. 1,000 words. The explosive force that shook the house was not a battering ram or a team of federal agents kicking down the door. It was the synchronized violent deployment of the estate's heavy steel security shutters. The massive metal plates, originally installed by Richard to protect his stolen assets from hurricanes and intruders, slammed down over the grand bay windows and the custom oak front doors with a deafening metallic crash. In a fraction of a second, the warm golden morning sunlight was completely obliterated. The opulent living room was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Henrik gasped, dropping his silver fountain pen onto the glass coffee table. It clattered loudly in the pitch-black room. Sydney let out a terrified scream, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. Beverly dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the imported Persian rug, the vintage Dom Perignon soaking into the expensive fabric. "What is going on?" Richard yelled, his voice echoing in the dark. "System, open the security shutters immediately. Restore normal lighting." The smart home system did not respond to his voice. Instead, the emergency LED lighting grid hidden within the crown molding suddenly powered on. But it was not the soft ambient white light Richard was accustomed to. The lights flared a harsh pulsing crimson red, bathing the entire living room in an eerie aggressive glow that made the luxury furniture look like a nightmare. "System," Richard roared, stepping toward the wall-mounted control panel. "I said open the shutters. Override emergency lockdown." I stood at the edge of the manicured front lawn, holding my smartphone in the palm of my hand. The crisp Saturday morning air filled my lungs. Next to me, Special Agent Reynolds and his tactical team were quietly staging behind their armored vehicles, waiting for my signal. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. The estate's master control application was open. For 32 years, Richard had controlled every aspect of this house. But as of midnight last night, the Jonathan Thorne Living Trust had officially transferred full unencumbered legal ownership to me. And as a Title and Escrow Auditor, I knew exactly how to exercise my property rights. First thing this morning, I had submitted the electronic deed transfer to the smart home security provider. Once they verified my identity and the federal trust documents, they revoked Richard's administrative access and handed the digital keys directly to me. I had complete control over the locks, the cameras, the lights, and the integrated audio system. I was the master of the house, and I was staging a technological revolt. Inside the living room, Richard was frantically tapping the wall-mounted touchscreen. The screen flashed a bright red error message. "Access denied. Administrator privileges revoked." "This is a malfunction," Richard lied, turning back to Henrik with a forced, panicked smile. "Just a glitch in the security mainframe. Please use the flashlight on your phone. We can still sign the paperwork. The wire transfer needs to be initiated right now." Henrik did not move a muscle. He was a seasoned international investor, and his survival instincts were screaming that this was not a technical glitch. I tapped the microphone icon on my smartphone app, connecting directly to the high-fidelity surround sound speakers hidden throughout the mansion's ceilings. I took a deep, steadying breath and began to speak. "I would strongly advise against signing that document, Henrik." My voice boomed through the grand living room, perfectly clear and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Sydney shrieked again, covering her ears. Beverly spun around in circles, looking up at the ceiling as if she could see me hiding in the drywall. Paige Richard yelled, his face turning an angry shade of purple under the pulsing red lights. "Turn this off right now. You are trespassing on my network. I will have you arrested for cyber terrorism." "You do not own the network, Richard." My voice echoed from the speakers, calm and entirely in control. "Just like you do not own the walls, the roof, or the ground you are standing on." "Henrik, my name is Paige Thorne. I am the sole legal owner of this estate. The man standing across from you is a fraud. He forged a power of attorney 4 years ago to take out a $2.5 million commercial mortgage against this property. He is currently under a federal investigation for massive tax evasion and wire fraud. If you sign that paper and wire him $4 million, the United States government will seize your funds as part of an active criminal enterprise, and you will never see a single dime of it again." Henrik looked at Richard, his eyes wide with absolute fury. "You told me the title was clean. You told me there were no disputes. She is lying." Richard screamed, completely losing his refined aristocrat persona. She is a bitter, disowned brat trying to ruin my life because I cut off her allowance. Sign the paper, Henrik. Do not listen to a lunatic talking through a speaker. Henrik slowly reached down and picked up his silver pen, but he did not sign the contract. He carefully placed the pen back inside his suit jacket, stood up from the plush leather sofa, and looked at Richard with pure disgust. The deal is entirely off, Richard. I do not do business with criminals. Henrik turned and marched toward the massive oak front doors. He grabbed the brass handles and pulled. The doors did not budge. The magnetic deadbolts were engaged, locked firmly in place by the master system I controlled from the lawn. "Open these doors right now," Henrik shouted, banging his fist against the solid oak. "They cannot open the doors," Henrik Fye announced smoothly through the overhead speakers. "I am the only one with the access codes. But do not worry, you are not trapped. You are just being safely detained until the authorities arrive." "What authorities?" Beverly screamed wildly. "These authorities," I replied, my actual voice now carrying through the grand foyer as the magnetic deadbolts disengaged with a loud mechanical clunk. The massive oak front doors swung wide open, pulled back by two heavily armed federal agents. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the flashing red and blue lights of the barricaded driveway behind me. I was not wearing the simple jeans and dark turtleneck from the night before. I had changed into a pristine, razor-sharp white tailored suit. It was the armor of a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide and everything to reclaim. Flanking my right side was Elias, walking into his childhood home with his head held high and his shoulders squared. On my left was Sheriff Miller, his hand resting casually on his duty belt, representing the local law enforcement presence, coordinating directly with the federal raid outside. I tapped the screen of my smartphone one last time. The blinding, pulsing red emergency lights immediately snapped off, replaced by the warm, elegant glow of the crystal chandelier overhead. The heavy steel security shutters retracted into the ceiling with a smooth mechanical hum, revealing the manicured front lawn, swarming with tactical vehicles and federal agents establishing a hard perimeter around the estate. Beverly let out a horrific guttural sound, stumbling backward until the back of her knees hit the edge of the plush leather sofa. She collapsed onto the cushions, her hands trembling violently as she stared through the bay windows at the army of law enforcement officers surrounding her fake kingdom. Richard stood completely frozen at the head of the glass coffee table, his gold fountain pen slipping from his numb fingers and clattering loudly to the floor. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking frail and sickly. He looked at me, then at Elias, and finally at Sheriff Miller's stern expression. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous aristocratic arrogance. "You cannot just barge into my home." "It is not your home," Richard Elias said, his voice deep and unwavering. "It never was." I walked straight past Richard, completely ignoring his pathetic attempt at manufactured outrage. I approached the massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted above the marble fireplace. I pulled a slim tablet from my leather portfolio and connected it directly to the multimedia hub on the mantel. I did not need to ask for the Wi-Fi password or permission. I owned the network. I swiped my finger across the tablet screen. The television clicked on, bypassing the luxury landscape screensaver and immediately mirroring my display for the entire room to see. "Mr. Henrik," I said, turning my attention to the European investor who was standing rigidly near the sofa. "I apologize for interrupting your morning champagne celebration. But as a title and escrow auditor, I have a professional and legal obligation to prevent fraudulent real estate transactions. Please direct your attention to the screen." I tapped the first file. A high-resolution scan of a federal grand jury indictment filled the massive television. The official seal of the United States Department of Justice sat at the very top, followed by a long, devastating list of felony charges. "What you are looking at is an active federal arrest warrant executed by a magistrate judge at 3 o'clock this morning," I explained, pacing slowly and confidently in front of the fireplace. "The primary individuals named on this warrant are Richard and Beverly. The charges include conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, felony tax evasion, and international money laundering. Henrik's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He took a large step away from Richard, treating the man as if he were suddenly highly contagious. I swiped to the next slide on my tablet. The forged commercial mortgage application appeared, the fraudulent signatures, and the expired notary stamp highlighted in bright neon yellow. 4 years ago, the couple standing in front of you forged a special power of attorney to illegally encumber this estate with a $2.5 million commercial loan. I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. They do not hold the title. They are not the legal trustees. They are simply squatters who stole the equity from my family trust to fund a fake lifestyle. If you had signed that purchase agreement today, you would have been handing $4 million in untraceable cash directly to federal fugitives. The United States government would have immediately seized your funds as criminal proceeds, and your bank in Geneva would currently be under investigation for facilitating international money laundering. Henrik turned his furious, calculating gaze toward Richard. You lied to my face. You sat there drinking my champagne and tried to make me an unwitting accomplice to a federal crime. Henrik, please. Richard pleaded, holding his hands up in a desperate, trembling gesture of surrender. This is a massive misunderstanding. She manipulated those digital documents. My lawyers will clear this entire situation up in a matter of hours. Speaking of your lawyers, I interjected smoothly, swiping to the final slide on my tablet. Let us talk about the brilliant legal mind who reviewed this transaction for you, your son-in-law Desmond. The screen shifted and a collective, horrified gasp echoed through the living room. It was a live, high-definition booking photo from the federal holding facility at the airport, transmitted to me directly by Special Agent Reynolds just 10 minutes ago. Desmond was staring directly into the camera. His tailored navy blazer was torn at the shoulder seam. His expensive silk tie was missing. His face was smeared with dirt from the terminal floor, and his eyes were wide with the unmistakable hollow look of a man whose entire arrogant life had just been violently destroyed. No, Sydney screamed, launching herself out of the armchair. She ran toward the television, her manicured hands flying to her mouth as she stared at her husband's mugshot in absolute horror. No, Desmond! What did you do to him? What did you do? I did not do anything to him, Sydney, I replied coldly, looking down at her. Airport police tackled him to the floor at Terminal 4 about an hour ago. He was trying to board a one-way flight to the Middle East with a duffel bag full of stolen cash and solid gold Krugerrands. He abandoned you. He drained his hidden safe and tried to run, leaving you and your parents to take the federal fall. His bank accounts are frozen, his assets are seized, and by Monday morning he will be officially disbarred and unemployable. Sydney collapsed to her knees right in front of the marble fireplace, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on me and parading her fake wealth was now a weeping mess on the floor of a house she was about to be forcibly evicted from. Henrik did not need to see anything else. He aggressively buttoned his suit jacket, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated European rage. He marched directly up to Richard, stopping just inches from his pale, terrified face. You are a pathetic, arrogant thief. Henrik spat, his accent thick with venom. If you ever contact my firm or my associates again, I will not call my corporate lawyers. I will call people who deal with thieves personally. Do you understand me? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat worked silently. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer totality of his defeat. Henrik turned to his silent associate. Grab the briefcase. We are leaving this crime scene, now. The two foreign investors did not look back. They stormed past Richard, completely ignoring Beverly's frantic, sobbing apologies, and marched straight toward the open front doors. Sheriff Miller stepped aside with a polite nod, allowing the furious buyers to exit the property unhindered. They walked briskly past the swarm of federal agents on the front lawn, got into their sleek black town car, and sped away down the driveway. The $4 million lifeline Richard had been desperately clinging to had just driven out of sight forever. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by Sydney's pathetic wailing. I stood proudly in front of the television, the glowing mugshot of Desmond casting a pale light over the completely shattered family. I smoothed the lapels of my white suit, feeling an overwhelming sense of vindication. The grand entrance was over. It was time for the final reckoning. The heavy, suffocating silence in the grand living room finally shattered. Richard let out a guttural, primal roar of absolute fury. The last thread of his sanity snapped entirely. He lunged across the glass coffee table, his polished shoes crunching over the shattered remains of Beverly's champagne flute. His hands were outstretched like claws, his face twisted into a mask of pure, violent hatred as he aimed directly for my throat. "You ruined everything," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. But he never even made it within 3 feet of me. Sheriff Miller moved with terrifying speed. He stepped squarely in front of me, grabbed Richard by the collar of his expensive gray suit, and used the man's own momentum against him. The sheriff spun Richard around and slammed him face first into the marble mantel of the fireplace. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply in the room. "You are under arrest for federal fraud," Richard Sheriff Miller stated calmly, locking the steel cuffs tightly around Richard's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. And looking at the massive hole you have already dug for yourself, I highly suggest you start using it immediately." Seeing her husband physically restrained and the absolute reality of her situation crashing down Beverly's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the Persian rug, her pristine white cashmere sweater bunching up awkwardly around her shoulders. She began to sob uncontrollably. These were not the fake, delicate tears she used to manipulate country club friends. These were the loud, ugly, gasping sobs of a woman who had just realized her entire fake empire was completely gone. She was entirely broke, and she was going straight to federal prison. "Paige, please!" Beverly wailed, crawling a few inches forward on her knees until she was looking up at me. "You cannot let them take us away. We raised you. We put food on your table for 32 years. I am your mother. Please have some mercy. We have absolutely nothing left." I looked down at the woman who had terrorized me for 3 decades. My expression did not soften for a single second. "You are not my mother, Beverly. You are a warden who kept me locked in a psychological prison because you needed my physical presence to steal millions of dollars. You did not put food on my table. My biological father did. You took the massive trust fund meant for my upbringing and used it to buy diamond necklaces, luxury cars, and a fake aristocratic identity. You forced me to wear cheap clothes while you dressed Sydney in designer labels. You fed me the cheapest scraps of affection while demanding absolute obedience. You made me live in the guest house like an unwanted burden while you threw lavish parties in my family's home." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a hard, unforgiving tone. "Yesterday you invited 40 people to a birthday party just to publicly humiliate me. You threw a fake DNA test in my face, demanded $300,000, and tried to throw me out into the cold rain with absolutely nothing. You did not have a single ounce of mercy for me then. Do not you dare beg for mercy now. The only thing you are going to get from me is a front row seat to your federal sentencing hearing." Sydney, who had been kneeling frozen by the sofa, scrambled to her feet. Her face was streaked with running mascara. Her perfect silk blouse wrinkled and ruined. She rushed toward me, throwing her arms open in a desperate, frantic attempt to hug me. "Paige, my beloved sister," Sydney cried out, trying to grab my shoulders. "I am so sorry. I did not know what they were doing. Desmond lied to me. My parents lied to me. We are sisters. We grew up together. Please, you have to let me stay here with you. I have nowhere to go. The federal government is going to seize my penthouse today. You are the only family I have left." I took a sharp step back, physically recoiling from her touch. I refused to let her hands soil my white suit. "Stop the pathetic act, Sydney. We are not sisters. Yesterday, you stood in this exact room and laughed while your husband threatened to bankrupt me. You told me I was a stray dog. You paraded your stolen wealth in my face for my entire life, constantly reminding me that I did not belong. You spent the last 10 years treating retail workers and waitstaff like garbage because you thought your last name made you royalty. Your last name is nothing but a federal case file now. You knew exactly who you were marrying. You married a man whose absolute greed perfectly matched your own. I pointed toward the glowing television screen displaying Desmond's ruined face. Desmond did not ruin your life, Sydney. He just funded it until the stolen money finally ran out. You loved the penthouse, you loved the credit cards, and you never once cared who had to bleed for you to get them. You are 29 years old. Your free ride is officially over. It is time you finally get a job and learn how to survive in the real world. I turned my attention back to Richard. He was breathing heavily against the marble fireplace, his cheek pressed against the cold stone. He was utterly defeated, but his eyes still held a lingering spark of arrogant resentment. You thought you were the smartest man in the room, Richard, I said, making sure every single word cut deep. You thought you could forge an entire existence because you believed everyone else was as stupid as you are greedy. But you made one fatal, hilarious mistake. You severely underestimated the daughter you held hostage. You thought I was just a glorified clerk, but I am a Title and Escrow Auditor. I hunt down arrogant financial criminals for a living. I dissect complex frauds every single day, and your pathetic, sloppy mortgage scam was the easiest target I have ever audited in my entire career. You handed me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy you. Elias stepped forward, standing proudly right beside me. He looked at Richard with quiet dignity. You stole 32 years from me, Richard, but you did not break my daughter. You only made her strong enough to take everything back. Special Agent Reynolds walked into the living room from the foyer accompanied by 3 more heavily armed federal agents. Take them all out, Reynolds ordered. The agents moved in swiftly. 2 of them hauled Beverly off the floor. She kicked and screamed wildly, her genuine pearl necklace snapping against an agent's tactical vest and scattering tiny white beads all across the hardwood floor. Sydney wailed hysterically, her legs giving out completely as a female agent read her Miranda rights and practically carried her toward the front door. Richard was completely silent, his head hanging low in absolute shame as Sheriff Miller marched him past me. I stood in the center of the grand living room and watched the 3 people who had made my life a living hell get dragged out of my house in steel handcuffs. The grand living room, once a stage for their toxic theater, was finally cleansed. The emotional ledger was balanced and the air felt incredibly light. Wait! I called out, my voice cutting sharply through the chaotic noise of the federal raid. Special Agent Reynolds and his tactical team paused right at the threshold of the massive oak front doors. They held Richard, Beverly, and Sydney firmly by their arms, their hands secured in heavy steel cuffs behind their backs. I walked slowly across the ruined Persian rug, my white suit immaculate against the backdrop of their absolute destruction. I stopped just inches away from Beverly. Her expensive makeup was completely smeared down her cheeks, and she looked like a terrified, broken shell of the arrogant woman who had tormented me for 3 decades. She refused to meet my eyes, staring down at the marble floor in utter disgrace. I raised my left arm and casually checked the time on my silver watch. Yesterday, you gave me exactly 5 minutes to pack up 32 years of my life and leave my own birthday party, I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of any sympathy. You wanted to throw me out into the rain with absolutely nothing, but I am going to be much more generous than you ever were. I will give your legal representation exactly 1 hour before the FBI gets here to completely lock down the premises. They will have 1 hour to collect whatever cheap, legally acquired personal belongings you still possess before the government seizes the rest of your fraudulent assets. I reached into the pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy metal ring. It was the exact same keychain Beverly had violently snatched from my hands the night before in this very room. I did not hand it to her. I tossed it lightly through the air. The heavy metal keys hit her pristine cashmere sweater and clattered loudly onto the polished marble floor directly at her feet. You can keep the plastic grocery store discount tags, I added coldly, stepping back. But the house keys stay with me. Special Agent Reynolds gave a sharp nod to his team. Move them out, he commanded. The agents marched the 3 of them out the door, down the grand stone steps, and toward the waiting armored transport vehicles parked on the driveway. I stood in the foyer and watched the entire procession. Richard kept his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in total humiliating defeat. Sydney continued to wail hysterically, her cries echoing across the manicured lawn until the heavy steel doors of the federal transport van slammed shut, silencing her completely. The massive oak front doors of the estate swung shut with a solid, resonant thud. For the first time in 32 years, the house was completely silent. The suffocating tension that had poisoned the air for my entire life was entirely gone. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling a massive weight lift from my chest. I turned away from the empty foyer and walked through the grand living room, stepping over the shattered champagne glass and the scattered pearl beads. I reached the back of the house and pushed open the massive glass doors leading to the rear patio. The crisp morning air washed over me. The sprawling 200-acre estate stretched out in front of me, a sea of vibrant green lawns, ancient oak trees, and a shimmering lake sparkling in the late morning sun. Elias was already out there. He was standing near the stone balustrade, his hands resting on the cool stone, looking out over the massive property that had been stolen from him so long ago. I walked over and stood shoulder to shoulder with my real father. He turned his head and looked at me, a deep, genuine smile crinkling the corners of his green eyes. "Welcome home, Paige," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It is good to be home," I replied, returning his smile. We stood there in a comfortable, healing silence, looking out at the land that was finally unequivocally ours. The war was officially over. Richard Beverly and Sydney were going to federal prison. Desmond was facing a complete destruction of his legal career and his freedom. The trust was secured, the massive financial fraud was exposed, and I had reclaimed my identity not as a discarded orphan, but as a brilliant, unshakable woman who fought back and won. There is a massive misconception in our society that you owe your family your unconditional loyalty, no matter how terribly they treat you. We are constantly told to forgive, to keep the peace, and to turn the other cheek, because blood is supposed to be thicker than water. But let me tell you the absolute truth. Blood does not give anyone the right to systematically destroy your mental health, steal your financial future, or treat you like a second-class citizen in your own life. For 32 years, I allowed those toxic people to define my worth. I allowed them to make me feel small, inadequate, and fundamentally unlovable. They weaponized my desire for a real family to turn me into a financial hostage. But the moment they pushed me too far, the moment they tried to strip me of everything I had earned, I woke up. I stopped crying. I looked at the facts and I realized that my greatest weapon was the very independence they tried so hard to suppress. If you are watching this right now and you are trapped in a toxic family dynamic, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not trapped. You are not powerless. The people who manipulate you rely entirely on your silence and your fear of confrontation. They want you to believe you cannot survive without their approval or their resources. It is an illusion. It is a carefully constructed lie designed to keep you exactly where they want you. Take back your power. Start setting ironclad boundaries. Educate yourself. Protect your finances and never let anyone bully you out of what you rightfully deserve. The moment you stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you, you become incredibly dangerous to them. Do not be afraid to walk away. Do not be afraid to stand your ground. And if they try to burn your life to the ground, use the flames to forge your own armor. Your worth is not determined by the people who abandoned you or the family members who betrayed you. Your worth is determined by your own strength, your own resilience, and your refusal to be a victim in a story where you are meant to be the hero. Have you ever had to stand up to a toxic family member and completely cut ties to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to finally walk away? I want to read your stories in the comments below. Let us build a community of strong, independent people who refuse to be silenced. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content about overcoming betrayal, exposing the truth, and reclaiming your absolute power. Share this video with someone who might be struggling with a toxic family situation right now. Show them that it is possible to fight back, win, and build a beautiful life on the other side of the storm. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, the best revenge is not just massive success. The best revenge is a life lived entirely on your own terms. Stay strong and I will see you in the next video.